still wakes the deep. Chapter 1. The Arrival. The North Sea churned beneath the helicopter, its grey waters frothing with white-capped waves that stretched to the horizon. Alistair McClary pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the Brent Charlie oil rig. The massive structure loomed larger with each passing second, its steel legs plunging into the depths like the talons of some great mechanical beast. McClary's stomach lurched, though whether from the helicopter's descent or the prospect of returning to the rig, he couldn't say. He'd been away for 2 weeks, 2 blissful weeks on solid ground with Mia and their daughter. Now, as the familiar sight of the helipad grew closer, the weight of responsibility settled back onto his shoulders. The chopper touched down with a bone-jarring thud, and McClary's hands instinctively tightened on his duffel bag. He took a deep breath, tasting salt and diesel on the wind as he stepped onto the helipad. The rotor wash whipped at his jacket, and he hunched his shoulders against the biting cold. "Welcome back to paradise, Mac!" The shout came from Finlay, his weathered face split by a wide grin as he jogged across the helipad. McClary managed a weak smile in return, clasping his friend's calloused hand. "Paradise, eh? Looks like I missed all the sunshine," McClary quipped, nodding at the leaden sky overhead. Finlay chuckled, clapping him on the back. "Aye, you know how it is. Nothing but blue skies and gentle breezes out here in the North Sea." As they made their way towards the accommodation block, McClary's eyes swept over the rig. Everything looked the same, the towering derrick, the maze of pipes and catwalks, the constant hum of machinery. And yet something felt off. A prickle of unease crawled up his spine. "How've things been?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Finlay's smile faltered for a moment. "Oh, you know, same old, same old. The boss man's been riding us hard, trying to make up for lost time after that last shutdown." McClary nodded, filing away the information. The boss man, a nickname that dripped with sarcasm, was notorious for pushing the crew to their limits. As they entered the living quarters, the familiar smell of industrial cleaner and stale cigarette smoke assaulted McClary's nostrils. "Honey, I'm home," he muttered under his breath. The common room was a hive of activity, with off-duty workers clustered around the TV, playing cards or simply lounging in worn armchairs. Heads turned as McClary entered, a chorus of greetings rising to meet him. "Look what the tide washed in. McClary, you ugly bastard! How's life on dry land, you lucky sod?" He raised a hand in acknowledgement, forcing a smile onto his face. These men were more than colleagues. They were a fractious, dysfunctional family, bound together by the isolation and danger of life on the rig. As he scanned the room, however, he noticed the absence of a few familiar faces. "Where's Roy?" he asked Finlay in a low voice. A shadow passed over Finlay's features. "Infirmary. Nasty accident in the drilling area yesterday. Nothing life-threatening, but he'll be laid up for a while." McClary frowned. Roy was one of the most experienced hands on the rig. For him to have an accident, it didn't sit right. Before he could press for more details, a booming voice cut through the chatter. "Well, well, look who's decided to grace us with his presence." The room fell silent as Chamberlain strode in, his bulk filling the doorway. The man's small eyes fixed on McClary, a humourless smile twisting his lips. "Hope you enjoyed your little vacation, McClary. Because playtime's over. We've got a lot of ground to make up, and I expect every man on this rig to pull his weight." "Understood." McClary met Chamberlain's gaze, feeling the familiar surge of antagonism. "Crystal clear, sir. Wouldn't want to disappoint you." A tense moment passed before Chamberlain grunted and turned away. As conversation slowly resumed in the common room, McClary felt the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Something had changed during his absence, a shift in the delicate balance of power and camaraderie that kept the rig functioning. As he made his way to his quarters, McClary's mind raced. The rig had always been a pressure cooker of tensions and rivalries, but now there was an undercurrent of fear, uncertainty. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the sensation nagged at him like a loose tooth. His cabin was just as he'd left it, cramped, utilitarian, and somehow both familiar and alien. McClary tossed his duffel bag onto the narrow bunk and sank into the desk chair with a sigh. From his pocket he pulled out a small voice recorder, a gift from Mia before he'd left. "For when you need to hear a friendly voice," she'd said, pressing it into his hand with a sad smile. McClary's thumb hovered over the play button for a moment before he set the recorder aside. Later. He'd listen to it later, when the ache of separation wasn't quite so raw. A sharp knock at the door startled him from his reverie. Yeah. The door creaked open, revealing Jesus, a wiry man with deep-set eyes and a perpetual nervous energy about him. "Hey, Mac, good to have you back." "Thanks, Jesus, everything all right?" Jesus glanced over his shoulder before stepping into the cabin, closing the door behind him. "Listen, I don't want to worry you, but things have been strange lately." McClary leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Strange how?" "It's hard to explain." Jesus ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Equipment malfunctions, weird noises in the night, and the dreams. God, the dreams. Dreams." Jesus shook his head as if trying to clear it. "Forget I said anything. It's probably nothing. Just keep your eyes open, yeah." Before McClary could press him further, Jesus slipped out of the cabin, leaving behind a trail of unease. Alone once more, McClary's gaze drifted to the small porthole. Beyond the thick glass, the North Sea stretched to the horizon, its surface choppy and dark. As he watched, a flicker of movement caught his eye, something large just beneath the waves. But when he blinked, it was gone. A chill ran down McClary's spine. He'd been on this rig for years, had seen it through storms and accidents and near disasters, but never, in all that time, had he felt the creeping dread that now settled over him like a shroud. Something was wrong on the Brent Charlie, and as the day shift klaxon blared through the corridors, McClary knew that his return marked the beginning of a nightmare he couldn't yet fathom. With a heavy sigh, he pushed himself to his feet. Whatever was coming, he'd face it head-on. It was all he knew how to do. As he stepped out into the corridor, the rig groaned and shuddered beneath his feet, a sound so familiar he almost didn't notice it. Almost. But this time it sounded less like the normal creaking of metal and more like a waking giant stirring from ancient slumber. McClary squared his shoulders and marched towards the control room. The sea might be hiding its secrets for now, but he was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. Chapter 2, Troubled Waters. The control room hummed with the steady beep of monitors and the low murmur of voices. McClary's eyes flicked from screen to screen, taking in the constant stream of data that kept the rig functioning. Everything looked normal, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness that had plagued him since his return. It gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, a persistent itch he couldn't quite scratch. "Pressure's dropping in section C-7, Kaz called out, her fingers flying over her keyboard. Again. McClary frowned, moving to peer over her shoulder. "That's the third time this week. What's engineering saying?" Kaz shrugged, frustration evident in the set of her shoulders. "Same as always. They can't find anything wrong with the system. It's like..." "Like what?" McClary prodded. She hesitated, chewing her lower lip. "Like the rig itself is bleeding out bit by bit." A chill ran down McClary's spine at her words. Before he could respond, a wave of dizziness washed over him. He gripped the edge of the console, blinking hard to clear the spots from his vision. "Mac, you all right?" Kaz's voice seemed to come from far away. McClary nodded, straightening up with effort. "Fine. Just need to check my levels." He fumbled in his pocket for his glucose meter, acutely aware of the concerned glances from his colleagues. His fingers trembled slightly as he pricked his finger, watching the small drop of blood well up. The meter beeped, and McClary squinted at the display. Too low, damn it. "I'm going to grab a snack," he announced, trying to keep his voice steady. "Keep an eye on that pressure drop. If it gets any worse, alert rank." The short walk to the mess hall felt like a marathon. By the time McClary reached the vending machine, his shirt was damp with sweat. He fumbled with his wallet, cursing under his breath as he dropped coins on the floor. "Here, let me—" A hand reached past him, inserting a coin and punching in the code for a candy bar. McClary turned to see Trot, the rig's medical officer, watching him with a mixture of concern and disapproval. "Thanks," McClary muttered, tearing into the wrapper and taking a large bite. Trot crossed his arms, leaning against the vending machine. "You know, there are better ways to manage your blood sugar than mainlining processed sugar." McClary swallowed, already feeling the glucose hitting his system. "Spare me the lecture, Doc. I've got it under control." "Do you?" Trot's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're one bad day away from a diabetic coma." Anger flared in McClary's chest, hot and familiar. "I said I've got it handled. Don't you have some band-aids to count or something?" He brushed past Trot, heading back towards the control room. But the doctor's words echoed in his mind, mingling with the ever-present hum of machinery. As he approached the control room, a cacophony of alarms greeted him. McClary broke into a run, bursting through the door to find chaos. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted over the din. Kaz's face was pale in the flickering emergency lights. "We've lost power to the entire Western Quadrant. Backup generators aren't responding." McClary's mind raced. The Western Quadrant housed critical systems, including the ballast control, if they couldn't restore power soon. "Finley, Connor, you're with me," he barked. "We need to get those generators online manually. Kaz, keep trying to route power from the other sections. And someone get Rank down here." As they hurried through the maze of corridors, the rig groaned and shuddered beneath their feet. McClary's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline mixing with the sugar rush from earlier. They reached the generator room to find it bathed in eerie red emergency lighting. The massive generators stood silent, their usual roar replaced by an oppressive quiet. "Check the fuel lines," McClary ordered, moving to the main control panel. His fingers flew over the switches and dials, searching for the source of the malfunction. Nothing. Every diagnostic came back clear, every system showed as functional, and yet the generators refused to start. "Fuel lines are clear," Finley reported. "No blockages, no leaks." McClary cursed, slamming his hand against the unyielding metal of the control panel. "This doesn't make any sense. It's like they just gave up." A low, rumbling sound filled the air, so deep it was felt more than heard. The hairs on the back of McClary's neck stood on end. "Did you hear that?" Connor whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Before anyone could respond, the generators roared to life. The sudden flood of light and noise was almost painful after the eerie silence. McClary blinked, momentarily disoriented. What the? His radio crackled to life. "Mac, power's back online in the Western Quadrant. Whatever you did, it worked." But he hadn't done anything. None of them had. As they made their way back to the control room, McClary couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just experienced something beyond their understanding. The rig had always been unpredictable, temperamental even. But this felt different. Hours later, long after his shift had ended, McClary stood at the window of his cabin, staring out at the moonlit sea. The events of the day played over and over in his mind, a puzzle with missing pieces. He reached for the voice recorder, Mia's gift, and pressed play. "Hey, love." Mia's voice filled the small space, warm and familiar. "I hope your first day back wasn't too rough. Remember, no matter what happens out there, you've got us waiting for you at home. Stay safe, Alistair. We love you." The recording clicked off, leaving McClary alone with the sound of the waves and the ever-present hum of the rig. A movement in the water caught his eye. A dark shape, massive and sinuous, sliding beneath the surface. For a moment he could have sworn he saw the glint of eyes looking back at him. Then it was gone, leaving nothing but choppy waves and moonlight. McClary's hand tightened on the voice recorder. Whatever was happening on this rig, whatever forces were at play beneath the waves, he would face them. For Mia, for their daughter, for the chance to go home. But as he turned away from the window, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a terrifying thought. What if home was no longer an option? The rig creaked and groaned around him, as if in answer, and in the darkness of his cabin, Alistair McClary felt very, very small. Chapter 3. The storm breaks. The sky darkened ominously as McClary made his way across the main deck, the wind whipping his jacket around him. He squinted against the stinging salt spray, his eyes fixed on the roiling mass of clouds gathering on the horizon. "Looks nasty," Finlay commented, appearing at McClary's side. "Weather reports calling it the storm of the decade." McClary nodded grimly. "Batten down the hatches, then. I want everything that's not bolted down secured. And double-check the emergency protocols." As Finlay hurried off to relay the orders, McClary cast one last glance at the approaching tempest. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural. The clouds seemed to writhe and twist, forming shapes that were almost familiar. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Tricks of the light, nothing more. In the control room, tension crackled like static electricity. Kaz's fingers flew over her keyboard, her face illuminated by the glow of multiple screens. "I'm getting some strange readings from the seabed sensors," she reported as McClary entered. "Seismic activity that doesn't match any known patterns." Before he could respond, a bone-deep tremor shook the rig. Alarms blared as equipment rattled in its housings. "What the hell was that?" McClary demanded, steadying himself against a console. Kaz's eyes were wide with fear. I don't know. It's like something hit us from below." The radio crackled to life, Rank's voice barely audible over the howling wind. "All hands, brace for impact. Massive wave incoming." McClary's stomach lurched as the rig tilted sickeningly. He grabbed the nearest handhold, gritting his teeth as the structure groaned and shuddered around them. The wave hit with the force of a freight train. Water crashed over the deck, finding every crack and crevice. In the distance, someone screamed. For a heart-stopping moment, McClary thought the rig might topple. But slowly, agonizingly, it righted itself. "Damage report!" He barked into his radio. Responses flooded in, a litany of destruction and near misses. Miraculously, no one seemed to be seriously hurt, but the rig had taken a beating. "Kaz, get me a line to the mainland," McClary ordered. "We need to," he broke off as he saw her face, pale and drawn in the emergency lighting. "I can't," she whispered. "All external communications are down." We're cut off." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. They were alone out here, at the mercy of the storm and whatever else lurked in the depths. Hours crawled by as they fought to keep the rig stable. The storm raged unabated, each gust of wind and crash of waves threatening to tear them from their precarious perch above the abyss. McClary moved through the corridors like a man possessed, shoring up weakened structures, coordinating repair efforts, doing whatever it took to keep them afloat. But with each passing moment, the sense of wrongness grew stronger. It was during a lull in the chaos that he heard it, a sound so alien, so utterly wrong, that it stopped him in his tracks. It started as a low moan, barely audible over the howling wind. But it grew, swelling into a cacophony of impossible notes that set McClary's teeth on edge and made his vision swim. And then he saw it. Through the driving rain and churning waves, a shape rose from the depths. Massive beyond comprehension, its form seemed to shift and change with each lightning flash. Tentacles thicker than the rig's support columns writhed in the air, while eyes the size of buses glowed with an otherworldly light. McClary's mind reeled, unable to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a trick of the storm and stress and low blood sugar. But the screams of his crew members told him otherwise. "Oh my God!" Jesus' voice came from behind him, barely a whisper. "It's real. The dreams. They were real." Before McClary could respond, a tentacle slammed into the side of the rig. Metal shrieked as it twisted and tore, and the entire structure listed dangerously. "Move!" McClary roared, shoving Jesus ahead of him as they ran for higher ground. All around them, chaos reigned. Men and women who had faced the worst the North Sea could throw at them now fled in blind panic from something their minds couldn't comprehend. They reached the upper deck, gasping for breath. McClary's heart pounded in his chest, a combination of exertion and raw, primal fear. "What do we do?" Jesus asked, his eyes wide and unblinking. "How do we fight that thing?" McClary opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat. Because at that moment the entity turned its gaze upon them. A wave of pure alien consciousness washed over McClary. Images flashed through his mind, ancient cities beneath the waves, civilizations rise and fall, secrets hidden in the deepest trenches of the ocean. And through it all, a hunger so vast and all-consuming that it threatened to swallow him whole. He came back to himself with a gasp, finding that he had fallen to his knees. Jesus was shaking him, shouting something that was lost in the roar of the storm and the entity's otherworldly cry. With a Herculean effort, McClary forced himself to his feet. His mind raced, searching for a solution, a way out of this nightmare. "The ballast control," he muttered, then louder. "The ballast control. If we can flood the pontoons, we might be able to submerge enough of the rig to get below its reach." It was a desperate plan, born of desperation and terror, but it was all they had. As they raced towards the control room, McClary caught glimpses of the battle raging around them. Flares arced through the air, briefly illuminating the entity's impossible form. The rig's defensive measures, designed to repel everything from pirates to rogue waves, seemed pitiful in the face of this cosmic horror. They burst into the control room to find it in chaos. Kaz was at her station, tears streaming down her face as she worked furiously to keep the rig's systems online. "Kaz!" McClary shouted over the din. "We need to flood the pontoons. Can you do it?" She looked at him as if he had gone mad. Maybe he had. But after a moment, understanding dawned in her eyes. She nodded, turning back to her console with renewed determination. "Brace yourselves," McClary called out, grabbing onto the nearest secure handhold. "This is going to get rough." The rig shuddered as the pontoons began to flood. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to sink lower in the water. The entity's tentacles lashed out, seeking purchase on the retreating structure. For a moment that stretched into eternity, McClary thought they might make it. The water rose higher, obscuring the lower decks, then the middle ones. But then a tentacle found its mark, wrapping around one of the rig's main support columns. Metal screamed as it bent and twisted, the integrity of the entire structure compromised in an instant. "It's not working," Jesus cried out, panic evident in his voice. "We're going to." His words were cut off as the rig gave a final Titanic shudder. McClary felt the floor drop away beneath him as the world tilted on its axis. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the entity's massive eye, staring at him with alien hunger. And in that gaze he saw the end of everything he had ever known or loved. Then there was only the rush of water, the screech of tearing metal, and the all-consuming darkness of the abyss. Chapter 4. Isolation consciousness returned to McClary in painful increments. First came the awareness of cold, a bone-deep chill that seemed to radiate from his very core. Then the ache, a symphony of bruises and strained muscles that made every breath a struggle. Finally, sound filtered in, the groan of stressed metal, the hiss of escaping steam, and the low moans of the injured. He forced his eyes open, blinking against the dim emergency lighting. The control room was a scene of utter devastation. Consoles sparked fitfully, shattered screens reflected fractured images of the chaos, and huddled forms of his crew members stirred feebly in the wreckage. Kaz McClary croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jesus, anyone." A groan from nearby answered him. He turned his head, wincing at the movement, to see Kaz struggling to extricate herself from beneath an overturned chair. "Mac." Her voice was thick with pain and confusion. What happened? The memories came flooding back, the storm, the entity, their desperate attempt to submerge the rig. McClary's heart raced as he remembered that alien gaze, that sense of ancient, implacable hunger. "We're still here," he muttered, more to himself than to Kaz. "Somehow we're still here." With a Herculean effort, McClary pushed himself to his feet. The room tilted alarmingly, and for a moment he feared they were still sinking. But no, it was just his battered equilibrium struggling to adjust. "Status report," he called out, his voice growing stronger. "I need to know who's hurt and how badly. And someone get me a damage assessment of the rig." As if his words had broken a spell, the room came alive with movement and sound. Those who could move began to help those who couldn't. Voices called out injuries and locations of trapped crew members. McClary made his way to the main console, praying that some of the systems were still operational. The screen flickered to life under his touch, displaying a schematic of the rig that was more red than green. "Jesus," he breathed, taking in the extent of the damage. Entire sections were flooded, structural integrity was compromised in multiple areas, and the life support systems were operating on emergency power. "Mac." It was Finley, his face pale beneath a mask of blood from a gash on his forehead. "What's the plan?" McClary turned to face the room, acutely aware of the eyes upon him. These people were looking to him for leadership, for hope. He took a deep breath, pushing down his own fear and uncertainty. "First priority is search and rescue," he said, his voice steady. "We need to account for every member of the crew and get the injured to the medical bay." "Finley, you're in charge of that. Take anyone who's able-bodied and start a systematic sweep of the rig." Finley nodded, already moving to organize teams. "Kaz," McClary continued, "I need you to get communications back online. We need to call for help." "With what?" Kaz asked, her voice tinged with hysteria. "Half the systems are fried, and in case you forgot, there's a bloody sea monster out there." "I haven't forgotten," McClary said quietly. "But right now, that thing is the least of our problems. We're taking on water, we've got injured crew members, and we're running on emergency power. If we don't get help soon, we're all dead anyway." The harsh truth of his words seemed to settle over the room like a shroud. McClary saw the fear in their eyes, the dawning realization of just how precarious their situation was. "Now, listen up," he said, raising his voice. "We've all been through hell, and I know you're scared, but we're still here. We're still fighting, and I promise you, we are not going to die on this godforsaken rig. But I need every one of you to dig deep and find whatever strength you've got left. Can you do that?" A murmur of assent rippled through the group. It wasn't exactly a rousing cheer, but it was something. It was a start. As the crews dispersed to their assigned tasks, McClary felt a hand on his arm. He turned to find Jesus, his eyes wide and haunted. "Mac," he whispered, "what was that thing? How is this possible?" McClary shook his head. "I don't know. But right now it doesn't matter. We focus on survival, one step at a time." Hours crawled by as they fought to stabilize the rig and account for the crew. The news was grim: 15 confirmed dead, another 20 injured, and 10 still unaccounted for. The once mighty structure groaned and shuddered around them, as if it might shake itself apart at any moment. In the medical bay, now overflowing with the injured, McClary found Trott working tirelessly to treat the wounded. The doctor's face was drawn with exhaustion, his hands steady even as fatigue threatened to overwhelm him. "How bad?" McClary asked quietly. Trott didn't look up from the wound he was suturing. "Bad. We're running low on supplies, and I've got at least 3 people who need emergency surgery. Surgery I can't perform here even if we had the equipment." McClary nodded, the weight of responsibility settling even heavier on his shoulders. "We're doing everything we can to get communications back online. Just do what you can." As he turned to leave, Trott's voice stopped him. "Mac, your glucose levels. Have you checked them?" With a start, McClary realized he hadn't. In the chaos of the past hours, he'd completely forgotten about his diabetes. He fumbled for his meter, pricking his finger with shaking hands. The reading made his heart sink. Dangerously low. "Here." Trott pressed a glucose gel into his hand. "You're no good to anyone if you fall into a diabetic coma. Take care of yourself, Mac. These people need you." McClary nodded his thanks, squeezing the gel into his mouth as he made his way back to the control room. The sickly sweetness seemed to mock him, a reminder of his own fragility in the face of the horrors they'd witnessed. Back in the control room, he found Kaz hunched over a jury-rigged communications array, her face illuminated by the flickering screen. "Any luck?" he asked, not daring to hope. She shook her head, frustration evident in every line of her body. "I've tried every frequency, every backup system. It's like there's nothing out there. No ships, no other rigs, no mainland, just static." A chill ran down McClary's spine. "That's not possible. Keep trying. There has to be someone out there." But as he turned away, a treacherous voice in the back of his mind whispered, "What if there isn't? What if that thing didn't just attack the rig? What if it's the harbinger of something much, much worse?" He pushed the thought away, focusing on the immediate problems at hand. They had injured to tend to, damage to repair, and a rig to keep afloat. The broader implications of what they'd witnessed would have to wait. As the hours wore on, a suffocating sense of isolation settled over the rig. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie calm. But the sea around them seemed different now, darker, more malevolent. Every shadow held the promise of tentacles, every unexplained sound sent hearts racing. In the mess hall, now converted into a makeshift gathering area for the able-bodied crew, McClary called a meeting. Tired, frightened faces looked up at him, silently pleading for reassurance he wasn't sure he could give. "I know you're all wondering what happens next," he began, his voice carrying in the hushed room. "The truth is, I don't have all the answers. We're in uncharted territory here. But what I do know is this: we're survivors. Every person in this room has faced the worst the North Sea can throw at us and come out the other side. And we'll face this the same way, together." He outlined their priorities, continuing the search for survivors, repairing critical systems, and maintaining a constant watch for any sign of the entity's return. As he spoke, he saw a glimmer of hope return to some eyes, a straightening of shoulders beaten down by fear and exhaustion. But as the meeting broke up and the crews returned to their tasks, McClary found himself standing alone at a window, staring out at the implacable sea. The entity was out there, somewhere in the depths, waiting, watching, and as the rig creaked and groaned around him, as the injured moaned and the frightened whispered, Alistair McClary faced the terrifying truth that had been growing in his mind since the attack. They weren't just isolated. They were alone in a world that had suddenly become much larger, much darker, and infinitely more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And their only hope for survival lay in facing that darkness head-on. With a deep breath, he turned away from the window. There was work to be done, and whatever horrors awaited them, whatever cosmic terrors lurked beneath the waves, McClary knew one thing for certain: he would fight. For his crew, for his family, for the chance to see the sun rise on a world that still made sense. He would fight until his last breath. Because in the face of the unknown, in the grip of utter isolation, fighting was all they had left. Chapter 5. The first casualty, the scream tore through the rig like a physical force, jerking McClary from his fitful sleep. He was on his feet and moving before his mind had fully processed the sound muscle memory from years of drills taking over. The corridors were a maze of shadows and emergency lighting, the air thick with the smell of damp and fear. As he raced towards the source of the scream, he could hear the pounding of feet and shouted questions echoing off the metal walls. He rounded a corner and nearly collided with Finley, the other man's face pale in the dim light. "Mac," Finley gasped. "It's Roy, in the infirmary." McClary's heart sank. Roy had been one of the more severely injured during the entity's attack, but last he'd heard, the man had been stable. What could have... His thoughts cut off abruptly as they entered the infirmary. The scene before him was one that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Roy's body lay on the floor, contorted in a way that no living person could achieve. His eyes were open, bulging from their sockets, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. But it was the wounds that drew McClary's horrified gaze. Deep, precise incisions covered Roy's body as if something had been systematically dissecting him. The floor around the corpse was surprisingly free of blood, considering the extent of the injuries. "Jesus Christ," Finley whispered, crossing himself. Trott knelt beside the body, his medical training warring visibly with his shock and revulsion. This isn't possible," he muttered, probing one of the wounds with a shaking hand. "These cuts, they're too clean, too precise, and where's all the blood?" McClary forced himself to approach, fighting down the bile that rose in his throat. "Time of death." Trott shook his head. "Hard to say without proper equipment, but based on body temperature, I'd estimate within the last hour." "An hour." McClary's mind raced. He'd been asleep, but there had been people on watch. How could this have happened without anyone noticing? "Who found him?" he asked, looking around the room. His eyes fell on Jesus, huddled in a corner with his arms wrapped tightly around himself, rocking slightly. "I did," Jesus whispered, his eyes never leaving Roy's mangled form. "I came to check on him, and he was." He was. McClary approached the traumatized man slowly, as if dealing with a frightened animal. "Jesus, I need you to focus. Did you see anyone else? Hear anything unusual?" Jesus shook his head violently. No, it was quiet. Too quiet. And then I saw. His words dissolved into quiet sobs. McClary placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer what comfort he could. "All right, listen up," he said, turning to address the growing crowd in the doorway. "I want this area sealed off. No one comes in or out without my express permission. Finley, organize search parties. I want every inch of this rig checked. If there's an intruder, we need to find them." As the crowd dispersed to carry out his orders, McClary felt a tug on his sleeve. It was Kaz, her eyes wide with a fear that went beyond the horror of Roy's death. "Mac," she whispered, "what if it wasn't an intruder? What if it was it? What if it's inside the rig?" The thought sent a chill down McClary's spine. The entity they'd seen had been massive, far too large to infiltrate the rig, but who knew what other forms it might take, what other horrors it might spawn. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the immediate problem. "We can't think like that, Kaz. We deal with what we know, not what we fear. Right now we have a dead crew member and a rig full of scared people. That's what we focus on." As the hours wore on, the search parties reported back one by one. No sign of intruders, no breaches in the hull, no explanation for how someone or something could have entered the infirmary undetected. The mood on the rig, already tense from their isolation and the lingering terror of the entity's attack, deteriorated rapidly. Whispered conversations fell silent when McClary approached. Suspicious glances were cast between long-time friends. The fear of the unknown was giving way to an even more dangerous enemy, fear of each other. McClary found himself in the unenviable position of not just keeping the rig functioning, but also holding together the fragile bonds of trust among the crew. He organized a memorial service for Roy, hoping that shared grief might counteract the growing paranoia. But as he stood before the assembled crew, looking out at their haunted faces, he could feel the undercurrent of tension, the unspoken accusations. "We've lost one of our own," he began, his voice carrying in the hushed room. "Roy was a good man, a skilled worker, and a friend to many of us. His death is a tragedy, and it's natural to want answers, to want someone or something to blame." He paused, meeting the eyes of those gathered before him. "But we cannot let fear and suspicion tear us apart. Whatever killed Roy, whether it was human or something else, it thrives on our division. We are stronger together. We must be stronger together, or none of us will survive this." As the impromptu service broke up, McClary noticed a small group hanging back, huddled in intense conversation. He approached cautiously, catching snatches of their whispered debate. "Not natural, those wounds. Could be one of us, you don't know. Should never have tried to submerge the rig." They fell silent as McClary drew near, guilt and defiance warring on their faces. "Something you want to share with the class?" he asked mildly, though his heart was pounding. There was a moment of tense silence before Archie, a veteran roughneck with a perpetual scowl, stepped forward. "Way I see it," he growled, "we got three possibilities. Either we got a psycho killer among us, that sea monster's gotten inside somehow, or—" He paused, his eyes boring into McClary. "Or someone's not telling us everything they know." The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but clear. McClary felt a flash of anger, quickly suppressed. Lashing out would only confirm their suspicions. "I've told you everything I know," he said evenly. "We're all in this together, Archie. If you've got theories, I'm all ears. But wild accusations aren't going to help anyone." Archie held his gaze for a long moment before looking away. "Just saying what everyone's thinking, Mac. You may be in charge, but that don't mean you get to keep secrets. Not when our lives are on the line." As the group dispersed, McClary felt the weight of their suspicion like a physical burden. He knew he had to find answers, and fast, before paranoia tore the crew apart. His investigation led him to the bowels of the rig, to areas damaged during the entity's attack. As he picked his way through twisted metal and sparking wires, his flashlight beam caught something odd, a viscous, iridescent substance smeared on a jagged edge of torn hull plating. McClary leaned in for a closer look, his breath catching in his throat. The substance seemed to shift and move, even without any air current, and as he watched it began to eat into the metal, leaving behind intricate alien patterns. "What the hell?" he breathed. A noise behind him made him whirl around, his heart pounding. But the beam of his flashlight revealed only empty corridor. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was moving just beyond the edge of his vision, always staying one step ahead. As he made his way back to the upper levels, McClary's mind raced. The substance he'd found, the precision of Roy's wounds, the impossibility of an intruder. It all pointed to a terrifying conclusion. Whatever had attacked them wasn't just out there in the ocean. It had found a way inside, and it was changing, adapting, becoming something they couldn't even begin to comprehend. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They weren't just fighting for survival against the elements, against isolation. They were fighting against an enemy that could be anywhere, could be anything, could be anyone. As he stepped into the control room, McClary looked at the faces of his crew, tired, scared, but still trusting him to lead them through this nightmare. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that he couldn't tell them what he'd discovered. Not yet. Not until he understood more, because the truth might be the thing that finally broke them. And in the depths of the rig, in the darkness beyond human sight, something smiled a smile that had never been meant for human eyes. The game was just beginning. Chapter 6. Descent into Darkness. The rig's klaxon shattered the uneasy quiet, its wail echoing through metal corridors like a banshee's cry. McClary was on his feet in an instant, muscle memory overriding exhaustion as he raced towards the control room. He burst through the door to find Kaz hunched over her console, her face illuminated by the angry red of warning lights. "Talk to me," he barked, scanning the screens for signs of the problem. Kaz's fingers flew over the keyboard, her voice tight with tension. "We're losing power, sector by sector. The main generator's failing and the backups aren't kicking in." As if to punctuate her words, the lights flickered ominously. McClary felt the vibration of the rig's machinery falter beneath his feet, like a great beast stumbling. "How long until total failure?" he asked, already running through scenarios in his mind. Kaz shook her head. "Hard to say. Maybe an hour if we're lucky. Less if the drain continues at this rate." McClary nodded grimly. "Right. We need to get down to the generator room, see if we can manually restart the system. Kaz, you're with me. And I want Finley and Connor too. We might need the muscle." As Kaz relayed the orders, McClary found himself staring at the rig schematics displayed on the main screen. The lower levels, where the generators were housed, were already dark, vast swaths of dead sensors and inactive systems. And somewhere down there, in that darkness, was the strange substance he'd discovered. The thought sent a chill down his spine. Minutes later, the small team assembled at the entrance to the lower levels. Finley and Connor looked grim, their faces pale in the flickering emergency lighting. "Listen up," McClary said, his voice low and urgent. "We don't know what we're going to find down there. Stay close, stay alert, and for God's sake, don't touch anything you don't absolutely have to." Clear, nods all around. McClary took a deep breath, tasting the metallic tang of fear in the air. "All right, let's move." They descended into the bowels of the rig, the stairwell growing darker with each step. Their flashlights carved weak paths through the gloom, shadows seeming to writhe and twist at the edges of the beams. The lower levels were a maze of narrow corridors and cramped machinery spaces. The air grew thick and heavy, tasting of rust and something else, something organic and deeply wrong. "Christ!" Connor muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like a bloody tomb down here." No one answered. They didn't need to. The comparison was all too apt. As they neared the generator room, McClary felt a change in the air, a vibration, almost subsonic, that set his teeth on edge. He held up a hand, signaling the others to stop. "You feel that?" he asked. Finley nodded, his eyes wide in the dim light, like something's humming, but not the generators. McClary was about to respond when a noise from up ahead froze the blood in his veins. It was a sound no human throat should be able to make, a keening wail that modulated into a series of clicks and whistles. "What the fu—" Connor's exclamation was cut short as McClary clamped a hand over his mouth. For a long, tense moment, they stood frozen in the darkness. The sound came again, closer this time. And with it, a new noise, the wet slap of something moving across metal. McClary's mind raced. Whatever was making that sound, it wasn't human. Not anymore. He thought of Roy's mutilated body, of the strange substance eating into the hull. "New plan," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We backtrack to the junction, then take the long way around to the auxiliary control panel. We might be able to reroute power from there." They began to retreat, moving as quietly as possible. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Connor's foot caught on a loose piece of grating. The clang of metal on metal echoed through the corridor like a gunshot. The inhuman wailing stopped abruptly, and then, horribly, it was replaced by the sound of rapid movement. coming towards them. "Run!" McClary shouted, all pretense of stealth abandoned. They fled through the darkness, flashlight beams bouncing wildly as they ran. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, punctuated by that awful alien keening. Kaz stumbled, crying out in pain. Without breaking stride, Finley scooped her up, carrying her as they raced through the maze of corridors. "There!" McClary gasped, spotting the auxiliary control panel. "Connor, get that door open." Connor slammed into the door, fumbling with the manual release. For a heart-stopping moment it refused to budge. Then, with a screech of protesting metal, it swung open. They piled inside, McClary bringing up the rear. As he turned to seal the door, he caught a glimpse of their pursuer. It had once been human. That much was clear from its general shape. But now it was a nightmare given flesh. Limbs bent at impossible angles, skin writhing with iridescent patterns. And its face, dear God, its face. McClary slammed the door shut, the sound of inhuman fists pounding against metal filling the small room. "What the hell was that?" Kaz gasped, her face ashen. McClary shook his head, trying to banish the image from his mind. "I don't know, but I think it used to be one of us." The implications of his words settled over the group like a shroud. Whatever had attacked them wasn't just killing. It was transforming, corrupting. "The panel," McClary said, forcing himself to focus. "Kaz, see what you can do." As Kaz worked, McClary found himself staring at the door. The pounding had stopped, but he could hear something, a faint scratching like claws on metal. "I've got it," Kaz exclaimed. "Rerouting power now." The lights flickered, then stabilized. The hum of machinery filled the air, blessedly normal after the alien sounds they'd encountered. But their victory was short-lived. As power surged through the rig systems, it brought the security cameras back online. And what they saw on the monitors turned their blood to ice. The lower levels were crawling with things, twisted, warped forms that had once been human. They moved with uncanny speed and purpose, spreading that strange, iridescent substance as they went. "It's spreading," Finley whispered, horror evident in his voice. "Like a bloody infection." McClary nodded grimly. "And we're the antibodies. We need to get back to the others, warn them, find a way to contain this, whatever it is." As they plotted their route back to the upper levels, carefully avoiding the areas of highest concentration, McClary couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, some crucial piece of the puzzle. The entity in the sea, the transformations, the strange substance. How did it all fit together? And more importantly, how could they stop it? As they made their perilous journey back to the relative safety of the upper levels, McClary's mind raced. They had restored power, but at what cost? What horrors had they awakened in the depths of the rig? And as the darkness pressed in around them, filled with unnatural sounds and movements just beyond the range of their flashlights, Alistair McClary faced a terrifying truth. They were no longer fighting just to survive. They were fighting to remain human. The descent into darkness, it seemed, had only just begun. Chapter 7. The entity revealed the control room crackled with tension as McClary recounted their harrowing experience in the lower levels. Faces pale and drawn, the crew listened in stunned silence, the horror of their situations sinking in with each word. "So, you're saying," Archie broke in, his voice hoarse, "that whatever that thing out there is, it's changing people, turning them into monsters?" McClary nodded grimly. "That's what it looks like. The substance we found, the transformations we saw, it's all connected somehow." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the persistent hum of machinery and the distant groan of stressed metal. It was Jesus who finally spoke, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else, recognition. "I've seen this before," he whispered. All eyes turned to him. McClary leaned forward, his heart racing. "What do you mean you've seen this before?" Jesus shook his head as if trying to clear it. Not exactly this, but something like it. In the old stories my grandmother used to tell about the deep places and the things that live there. McClary exchanged a glance with Finlay. Could there be some connection between this cosmic horror and ancient folklore? Tell us, McClary urged gently. Any information could help us understand what we're dealing with. Jesus took a deep breath, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality as if reciting from memory. In the time before time, when the sea was young and the land was still forming, there came from the stars beings of great power and terrible hunger. They sank into the depths, building cities of impossible geometry, bending the very fabric of reality to their will. And they waited, patient as only immortal things can be, for the day when they would rise again and claim all that dwells above and below the waves. As Jesus' words faded, the control room seemed to shrink, the vastness of the ocean pressing in on all sides. McClary felt a chill run down his spine, the pieces starting to fall into place. "It's not just a sea monster," he murmured. "It's something. Older. Something alien." Kaz, who had been furiously typing at her console, suddenly let out a gasp. "Mac, you need to see this." She pulled up a series of news articles and classified reports on the main screen. Headlines flashed by "Mysterious Disappearances in North Sea 1924", classified incident report, Operation Deep Dive 1962, cover-up alleged in offshore drilling accident. 1998. "I've been digging through any data I could access," Kaz explained, her voice tight with excitement and fear. "There's a pattern. Unexplained incidents, sightings of strange creatures, entire crews vanishing without a trace. All centered around this part of the North Sea." McClary's mind raced. "They knew," he breathed. "The company, the government. They must have known something was out here. The implications were staggering. How long had this entity been influencing human affairs? How many lives had been lost to its unfathomable hunger?" As if in response to their revelations, a low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the rig. It started almost imperceptibly, but quickly grew in intensity until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What the hell is that?" Finlay shouted over the noise. Before anyone could respond, the main screen flickered and went dark. When it came back to life, it showed not the rig's systems, but a swirling, hypnotic pattern that seemed to pulse with alien intelligence. And then, impossibly, it began to speak. The voice was not sound as they understood it, but rather a series of impressions and concepts that bloomed directly in their minds. It was ancient beyond comprehension, vast beyond imagination, and utterly terrifyingly alien. "We are the deepness beneath the deepness," it said, thought-impressed. "We are the hunger that consumes worlds. We are the shapers of flesh and reality." McClary found himself on his knees, blood trickling from his nose as he struggled to comprehend the entity's communication. Around him, he could see the others in similar states of distress. "You are but motes in the vastness of our existence," the entity continued. "Your flesh is clay to be reshaped. Your minds are vessels to be filled with our truth." Images flashed through McClary's mind. Civilizations rising and falling beneath alien seas, great wars fought with weapons that bent the very fabric of space-time, evolution twisted and accelerated to serve the entity's inscrutable purposes. "We have slumbered, dreaming of the day when the stars would align once more. And now you have awakened us." The last thought carried with it a sense of gratitude so perverted, so wrong, that McClary felt bile rise in his throat. "Your world will be remade in our image, and you shall be the harbingers of our return." As suddenly as it had begun, the communication ceased. The humming stopped, the screen returned to normal, and the crew found themselves gasping and shaking in the aftermath of the entity's revelation. "Oh God!" Kaz whispered, tears streaming down her face. What was that?" McClary struggled to his feet, his mind reeling from the cosmic horror they had just witnessed. "That," he said, his voice hoarse, "was our enemy showing its hand." The full scale of their predicament crashed down upon them. They weren't just fighting for survival against a sea monster or some unknown threat. They were up against an ancient alien intelligence that viewed humanity as little more than raw material to be reshaped. "What do we do?" Finley asked, voicing the question on everyone's mind. "How do we fight something like that?" McClary looked around the room at the faces of his crew, scared, but still looking to him for leadership, for hope. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "We fight with everything we've got," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We may be small in the face of this entity, but we're not helpless. It's made its move, shown us what we're up against. Now it's our turn." He turned to Kaz. "I want every scrap of information you can find about similar incidents, any weaknesses we might be able to exploit. Jesus, I need you to remember every detail of those old stories. There might be some kernel of truth, some way to fight back." As the crew set to their tasks with renewed purpose, McClary found himself drawn to the window, staring out at the implacable sea. Somewhere out there, in the crushing depths, an alien god was stirring, and whether they liked it or not, they were now part of a war as old as the earth itself. The entity had been revealed, but the true battle was only just beginning, and as the rig creaked and groaned around them, as the transformed horrors that had once been their colleagues prowled the lower levels, Alistair McClary made a silent vow. They would find a way to stop this, to save not just themselves, but all of humanity from the nightmare that lurked beneath the waves. Because if they failed, the world as they knew it would cease to exist, and what would rise in its place was too terrible to contemplate. Chapter 8. Fractured Unity. The aftermath of the entity's revelation hung over the rig like a toxic cloud. In the hours that followed, McClary watched as the tenuous bonds holding his crew together began to fray and snap under the weight of cosmic horror and all too human fear. The mess hall, once a place of camaraderie and shared meals, had become a powder keg of tension. McClary stood at the threshold, taking in the scene before him. The crew had divided into small, huddled groups, voices rising and falling in heated debate. "We can't stay here." Archie's voice cut through the din, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and anger. That thing is going to kill us all if we don't get off this godforsaken rig." "And go where?" Finley shot back, his usual easygoing demeanour replaced by grim determination. "In case you've forgotten, we're in the middle of the bloody North Sea. There's nowhere to go." McClary stepped forward, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. "All right, let's all take a breath. Arguing amongst ourselves isn't going to solve anything." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The revelation of the entity's true nature had shattered something fundamental in the crew's psyche. The world they thought they knew had been turned upside down, and each person was grappling with that reality in their own way. "Maybe we should give ourselves up," a quiet voice suggested from the corner. All eyes turned to Jesus, who sat with his head in his hands. "Maybe if we willingly join it, it'll spare us the worst." A chorus of outraged shouts met this suggestion. McClary felt a chill run down his spine. If they were already considering surrender. "That's not an option," he said firmly, silencing the room. "We are not giving up, and we are not turning on each other. We've faced tough situations before, and we've always come through by working together." "This isn't a tough situation, Mac," Kaz interjected, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep and constant fear. This is the end of the world." "How are we supposed to fight something like that?" McClary opened his mouth to respond, but found he had no answer. The doubt that had been gnawing at him since the entity's communication threatened to overwhelm him. How could they fight something so vast, so alien? He was saved from having to respond by the sudden blare of alarms. The crew froze, looking around in panic. "Containment breach in lower levels," the automated system announced in its maddeningly calm voice. "Biohazard detected. Emergency protocols engaged." For a moment, no one moved. Then, as one, they turned to McClary. He took a deep breath, pushing down his own fear and doubt. "Kaz, Finley, you're with me. We need to get to the control room and assess the situation. The rest of you, seal off this level and prepare for possible evacuation." As they rushed through the corridors, McClary's mind raced. The transformed crew members they'd encountered earlier. Had they broken through the makeshift barriers? In the control room, Kaz's fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up security feeds and system diagnostics. "It's bad, Mac," she reported, her voice tight. The infected have breached the containment on level 3. They're spreading that substance everywhere they go. At this rate, we'll lose the entire lower half of the rig within hours." Finley cursed under his breath. "We can't let that happen if that stuff reaches the critical systems." McClary nodded grimly. "We need to stop it. Seal off the affected areas, use the fire suppression systems to try and slow its spread." As they worked frantically to contain the threat, McClary couldn't shake the feeling that they were just delaying the inevitable. The entity's words echoed in his mind, "Your world will be remade in our image." Hours passed in a blur of alarms, emergency protocols, and increasingly desperate measures. By the time they managed to stabilize the situation, all three were exhausted physically and mentally. "We can't keep this up forever," Kaz said softly, voicing what they were all thinking. "Sooner or later, we're going to run out of places to retreat to." McClary nodded, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical force. "I know, but we're not there yet. We've bought ourselves some time, and that's what we need to focus on." When they returned to the mess hall to update the crew, they found the situation had deteriorated even further. Archie had gathered a group around him, their faces set in grim determination. "We're leaving," he announced as McClary entered. "We can't sit here and wait to be turned into those things. We're taking one of the lifeboats and taking our chances on the open sea." McClary felt a flash of anger, quickly suppressed. "That's suicide, Archie. You know as well as I do that a lifeboat won't last long in these waters." "Maybe," Archie conceded, "but it's better than waiting here to be consumed by that alien horror. At least out there, we have a chance." The room held its breath, waiting to see how McClary would respond. He looked around, seeing the fear, the desperation in the eyes of his crew. They were fracturing, coming apart at the seams. And if he couldn't hold them together? "I can't force you to stay," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of his words. "But I'm asking you, all of you, to think about what you're doing. We're stronger together. If we start splitting up now, we're playing right into that thing's hands." He paused, meeting each person's gaze in turn. "I know you're scared. Hell, I'm terrified. But we've got something that entity doesn't understand, something it can't comprehend. We have each other. We have our humanity. And as long as we hold on to that, we have a chance." A tense silence fell over the room. McClary could see the conflict playing out on their faces, the urge to flee warring with the need for unity, for hope. Slowly, reluctantly, Archie's group began to disperse. The immediate crisis had been averted, but McClary knew it was only temporary. The cracks in their unity had been exposed, and it would take more than words to heal them. As the crew settled into an uneasy calm, McClary found himself drawn once again to the window. The North Sea stretched out before him, dark and implacable. Somewhere out there, the entity waited. Planning, hungering. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, closing his eyes. The doubts he'd been holding at bay came rushing in. Was he doing the right thing by keeping them here? Was he leading them to salvation or damnation? A hand on his shoulder startled him from his reverie. He turned to find Finley standing there, concern etched on his weathered face. "You all right, Mac?" he asked softly. McClary managed a weak smile. "Just thinking, wondering if I'm cut out for this. if I'm making the right calls." Finley squeezed his shoulder. "You're doing the best you can with an impossible situation. We all see that. And despite what just happened in there, they still look to you. They still believe in you." McClary nodded, grateful for the support but still wrestling with his inner turmoil. "And what if I'm wrong? What if I'm leading us all to our doom?" "Then we face it together," Finley said simply. "That's what you've always taught us, isn't it? We sink or swim as one." As Finley walked away, McClary turned back to the window. The doubt was still there, a constant companion in these dark times. But alongside it he felt a flicker of something else, something he'd almost forgotten in the face of cosmic horror and human frailty. Hope. It was fragile, barely more than a spark. But it was there. And as long as that spark remained, as long as they held on to their humanity and their unity, they had a chance. The rig creaked and groaned around him, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their situation. The transformed horrors prowled the lower levels, and an alien god waited in the depths. But here, in this moment, Alistair McClary made a silent vow. He would hold them together. He would find a way through this nightmare, not just for himself or for his crew, but for all of humanity. Because in the face of unfathomable cosmic horror, their unity, their very human ability to stand together against the darkness, might just be their greatest weapon. And as the North Sea churned beneath them, as the entity's influence crept ever closer, that unity would be tested as never before. Chapter 9. The Failed Escape. The pre-dawn darkness cloaked the rig in shadows, the faint glow of emergency lighting casting an eerie pallor over the faces of the crew. McClary stood on the main deck, the wind whipping at his jacket, as he watched Archie and his group make final preparations on the lifeboat. Despite his best efforts, despite the momentary unity they'd achieved, fear had won out. 6 of the crew, led by Archie, had decided to take their chances on the open sea rather than face the horrors that lurked within the rig. "This is your last chance," McClary called out, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "Once you're out there, there's no coming back." Archie paused in his work, turning to face McClary. In the dim light, his face looked gaunt, haunted. "We know the risks, Mac. But staying here, it's a death sentence. At least out there, we have a chance." McClary wanted to argue, to point out the futility of their plan, but he knew it would fall on deaf ears. Fear had a way of drowning out reason, of making the impossible seem preferable to the unthinkable. "Then at least take these," he said, holding out a pack of emergency rations and a waterproof radio. "If you run into trouble, if you spot any ships, you call us." "Understand." Archie nodded, accepting the items with a grim smile. "Thanks, Mac, for everything. I hope you find a way to beat this thing." As the small group boarded the lifeboat, McClary felt a presence at his side. It was Finley, his face a mask of concern and resignation. "This is a mistake," Finley muttered. "They're going to their deaths." McClary nodded, watching as the lifeboat was lowered into the churning sea. "I know. But we can't force them to stay. All we can do now is pray they make it." The lifeboat hit the water with a splash, its engines sputtering to life. As it began to move away from the rig, a cheer went up from those on board, a sound of desperate hope that cut McClary to his core. For a few minutes it seemed as though their mad gamble might pay off. The lifeboat made steady progress, growing smaller against the vast expanse of the North Sea. And then everything went to hell. It started with a change in the water. The choppy waves suddenly smoothed out, as if some great force was rising from the depths. A faint phosphorescent glow began to spread beneath the surface, casting an otherworldly light over the scene. "Oh God," Finley breathed. "It's coming." Before McClary could respond, a scream cut through the air, high, terrified, and abruptly silenced. The lifeboat's progress halted, and even from this distance they could see the panic on board. "We have to help them," McClary said, already moving towards the second lifeboat. But Finley's iron grip on his arm stopped him. "Look," Finley said, his voice choked with horror. The sea around the lifeboat was alive with movement. Tentacles, glowing with that same eerie light, rose from the depths. They were massive, dwarfing the tiny vessel and its terrified occupants. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the tentacles hovered in the air as if considering their prey. Then, with a speed that defied belief, they struck. The lifeboat was torn apart in seconds, its occupants tossed into the roiling sea. Their screams echoed across the water, a symphony of terror that would haunt McClary's dreams for years to come. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The sea calmed, the glow faded, and there was no sign that the lifeboat or its occupants had ever existed. McClary stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. 6 lives snuffed out in an instant. 6 of his crew gone. The radio in his hand crackled to life, Archie's voice cutting through the static. "Mac? Oh, God, Mac! It's everywhere. It's in the water. It's... ah!" The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only the hiss of dead air. For a long moment, no one on the deck moved or spoke. The horror of what they had just witnessed had struck them dumb, their minds reeling from the implications. It was Kaz who finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. It let them think they were escaping. It toyed with them. McClary turned to face the remaining crew, seeing his own shock and grief mirrored in their eyes. "Get inside," he said, his voice hoarse. Now, as they filed back into the relative safety of the rig's interior, McClary cast one last glance at the now calm sea. The entity's message was clear. There was no escape. They were trapped, not just by the physical confines of the rig, but by the very ocean itself. In the control room, the mood was sombre, the air thick with unspoken fear and guilt. McClary looked at the faces of his remaining crew, seeing the toll this latest horror had taken on them. "I know what you're all thinking," he said, breaking the heavy silence. "That could have been us. That maybe Archie and the others had the right idea that staying here is a death sentence." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But what we just saw proves something. It proves that running isn't an option. That thing out there, whatever it is, it controls the sea. It's toying with us, trying to break us down piece by piece." "So what do we do?" Jesus asked, his voice trembling. "How do we fight something like that?" McClary took a deep breath, steeling himself. "We do what we've always done. We adapt. We survive. And we find a way to fight back." He turned to Kaz. "I want you to analyze every scrap of data we have on that thing's appearances. Energy readings, sonar, everything. There has to be a pattern, something we can use." To Finley and Connor he said, "I need you to take stock of every weapon, every tool, every bit of equipment we have on this rig. If we're going to fight, we need to know exactly what we're working with." As the crew set about their tasks, McClary found himself drawn once again to the window. The sun was rising, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt like a mockery, a reminder of the world they might never see again. He thought of Archie and the others, of their final moments of terror. He thought of Mia and their child, waiting for him on the mainland, unaware of the cosmic horror that threatened to reshape their world. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. They had to find a way to stop this thing, not just for themselves, but for all of humanity. Because if they failed, if this entity was allowed to rise... McClary shuddered at the thought. The world as they knew it would end, replaced by something alien and terrible beyond comprehension. As he turned away from the window, McClary caught sight of his reflection. He hardly recognized the man staring back at him, gaunt, haggard, eyes haunted by the horrors they'd witnessed. But beneath the fear and exhaustion he saw something else, a determination, a spark of defiance. They had lost friends today. They had seen the true extent of the entity's power and cruelty, but they were still here, still human, still fighting. And as long as that remained true, there was hope. The failed escape had cost them dearly, but it had also shown them the truth of their situation. There was no running, no hiding. They would make their stand here, on this battered rig in the middle of the North Sea, against an ancient alien god that sought to remake the world in its image. They would fight with every ounce of their humanity, because, in the end, that humanity, their ability to hope, to adapt, to stand together in the face of cosmic horror, might just be the one thing the entity couldn't understand. And in that lack of understanding, McClary realized, might lie their only chance at survival. Chapter 10. Descent into Madness. The days following the failed escape blurred together, a haze of fear, exhaustion, and creeping dread. The rig, once a bustling hive of activity, had become a tomb of sorts, a metal coffin suspended between the uncaring sky and the alien horrors that lurked beneath the waves. McClary found himself making constant rounds, checking on systems, on his crew, on the ever-present threat of the entity's influence spreading through the lower levels. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and plagued by nightmares of tentacles and impossible geometries. It was during one of these rounds that he first noticed the change in Jesus. He found the man in the mess hall, hunched over a table, muttering to himself. Scattered around him were dozens of pieces of paper covered in intricate, swirling patterns that made McClary's eyes hurt to look at directly. Jesus. McClary approached cautiously. "You all right, mate?" Jesus' head snapped up, his eyes wild and unfocused. "Mac, I figured it out. I figured it all out." McClary's heart sank. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of men pushed beyond their limits. "Figured what out, Jesus?" "The patterns, Mac. The sacred geometry. It's all there, in the old stories, in the entity's communication. We've been looking at it all wrong. We don't need to fight it. We need to join it, become one with it. It's the only way." Jesus grabbed one of the papers, shoving it into McClary's hands. "Look, can't you see it? The way the lines intersect, the curves, the angles, it's a map, Mac, a map to transcendence." McClary looked down at the paper, and for a moment he thought he could see what Jesus was talking about. The patterns seemed to move, to pulse with an inner life. They whispered of secrets, of knowledge beyond human comprehension. He felt a pull, an urge to lose himself in those impossible geometries. With a supreme effort of will, McClary tore his gaze away, crumpling the paper in his fist. "Jesus, listen to me. This isn't you talking. It's that thing getting inside your head. You need to fight it." But Jesus was beyond reason. He leapt to his feet, his face contorted with a mixture of rapture and terror. "No, you don't understand. We can't fight it. We can only surrender. It's calling to us, Mac. Can't you hear it? The song of the depths, the hymn of the cosmos." Before McClary could react, Jesus bolted from the room, his maniacal laughter echoing through the corridors. "Damn it," McClary muttered, reaching for his radio. "Finley, Connor, we've got a situation. Jesus has lost it. Find him and contain him before he hurts himself or someone else." As he set off in pursuit, McClary couldn't shake the lingering effects of those patterns. Even now, crumpled in his fist, the paper seemed to pulse with malevolent life. He forced himself to focus on the immediate problem, pushing the whispers of cosmic secrets to the back of his mind. The hunt for Jesus took them deep into the bowels of the rig. They found him in the generator room, stripped to the waist, using his own blood to paint those maddening patterns on the walls. "Jesus, stop!" McClary called out, approaching slowly with his hands raised. "You're hurting yourself." "Let us help you." Jesus turned, his eyes gleaming with an inner light that was not entirely human. "Help me." "You can't help me, Mac. None of us can be helped. We can only be transformed." He raised his arms as if in supplication to some unseen God. "I understand now. Why fight it? Why cling to our small, insignificant lives when we could be part of something vast, something eternal?" As he spoke, McClary noticed with horror that Jesus' skin was beginning to ripple and shift, iridescent patterns forming beneath the surface. "Connor! Finley! Grab him!" McClary shouted. The next few minutes were a chaos of flailing limbs and inhuman shrieks. By the time they managed to subdue Jesus, all three men were battered and bleeding. They carried his unconscious form to the medical bay, where Trot was waiting with restraints and a grim expression. "How many does this make now?" McClary asked as they secured Jesus to the bed. Trot shook his head. "Too many. We've got 4 in full psychotic breaks, another 6 showing early signs of mental deterioration. And those are just the obvious cases." McClary nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical force. "And the transformations. Spreading," Trot replied quietly. "Whatever that substance is, it's not just changing their bodies. It's altering their minds, their very perception of reality." As if to underscore his words, Jesus began to stir, his eyes fluttering open. But the person who looked out from those eyes was not the man McClary had known. "The stars are right," Jesus whispered, his voice a raspy approximation of human speech. "The deepness stirs. We are but motes in the eye of eternity, Mac. Why do you resist? Why do you deny the truth of your own insignificance?" McClary turned away, unable to bear the sight of his friend's madness. "Sedate him," he ordered Trot. "Keep him under until we figure out what to do." As he left the medical bay, McClary's steps faltered. The corridors seemed to stretch and warp around him, the metal walls pulsing with alien life. He shook his head, trying to clear the disorienting visions. "Get it together, Alistair," he muttered to himself. "They need you. You can't lose it now." But even as he said the words, he felt the tendrils of madness creeping at the edges of his consciousness. The things he'd seen, the horrors they'd endured. How long could any human mind withstand such pressure? He made his way to his quarters, desperate for a moment of peace, of normalcy. But as he entered the small room, he found Kaz waiting for him, her face pale and drawn. "Mac," she said, her voice trembling. I think I'm losing my mind." McClary felt his heart sink. Kaz had been his rock throughout this nightmare, her rational mind a bulwark against the encroaching chaos. If she was starting to crack. "Talk to me," he said gently, guiding her to sit on the edge of his bunk. Kaz took a shuddering breath. "I keep seeing things, impossible things, the computers, the data. It's all changing, rearranging itself into patterns I can almost understand. And when I sleep," she broke off, shuddering. "When you sleep," McClary prompted. "I dream of cities," Kaz whispered. "Vast, alien cities beneath the waves. And I'm there, Mac, not as I am now, but changed, transformed. And in the dream it feels right. It feels like coming home." McClary felt a chill run down his spine. Kaz's words echoed his own hidden fears, the traitorous thoughts that whispered to him in the dark watches of the night. "Listen to me," he said, taking her hands in his. "Those aren't your thoughts. They're not your dreams. That thing out there, it's trying to get inside our heads. But we can fight it. We have to fight it." Kaz looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "How? How do we fight something that can reshape reality itself? How do we hold on to our sanity when everything around us is going mad?" McClary wished he had an answer. He wished he could offer some words of comfort, some strategy that would see them through this nightmare. But the truth was, he was as lost as the rest of them. "We hold on to each other," he said finally. "We remember who we are, where we came from. We focus on the things that make us human, our connections, our memories, our hope for the future." As he spoke, McClary reached into his pocket, pulling out the small voice recorder Mia had given him. He hadn't listened to it since that first night, too afraid of the pain it might bring. But now, he pressed play and Mia's voice filled the small room. "Hey, love. I hope you're doing all right out there. Lily drew a picture of you today. She says it's you fighting sea monsters." A soft laugh. I told her you're too busy keeping the rig running to fight monsters, but she insists her daddy is a hero. We miss you, Alistair. Come home safe to us. The message ended, leaving behind a silence that was somehow more profound than before. McClary looked up to see Kaz watching him, a mix of emotions playing across her face. That's how we fight it, he said softly. We remember what we're fighting for. We hold on to our humanity with everything we've got. Kaz nodded, wiping away her tears. You're right. God, you're right. I got lost for a moment there. As Kaz left, her steps a little steadier, her back a little straighter, McClary sank onto his bunk. The weight of responsibility, of the constant struggle to maintain not just his own sanity, but that of his entire crew, pressed down on him. He looked at the voice recorder in his hand, thinking of Mia and Lily, of the world beyond this metal prison suspended between madness and death. They had to find a way through this. They had to, because if they failed, if they gave in to the madness that pressed in from all sides, it wouldn't just be their own lives lost. It would be the end of everything they knew, everything they loved. The descent into madness was a slope as slippery as it was steep. But as long as they had each other, as long as they remembered what they were fighting for, they had a chance. A small chance, perhaps, but in the face of cosmic horror and impending doom, it was all they had. And for now, it would have to be enough. Chapter 11, The Flooding Begins. The klaxon's wail jerked McClary from his fitful sleep, its urgent cry cutting through the constant hum of machinery. He was on his feet and moving before his mind had fully grasped consciousness, muscle memory born of countless drills taking over. As he burst into the control room, the scene that greeted him sent a chill down his spine. Red warning lights flashed across every console, and the main display showed a schematic of the rig with entire sections pulsing an angry crimson. "Talk to me," he barked, making his way to Kaz's station. Kaz's fingers flew over her keyboard, her face pale in the flashing lights. "We've got multiple hull breaches in the lower levels, Mac. Water's pouring in faster than the pumps can handle." McClary leaned in, studying the schematic. The flooding was concentrated in the lowest levels, but it was spreading rapidly. If they couldn't contain it. "How long?" he asked, dreading the answer. Kaz shook her head. "At this rate. Maybe 3 hours before we lose the entire lower section, including the main power generators and life support systems." The implications hit McClary like a physical blow. Without those systems, the rig would become nothing more than a metal coffin suspended above the abyss. "Right," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Kaz, I want you coordinating from here. Use every pump we've got. Try to buy us some time. Finley, Connor, you're with me. We need to get down there and see if we can seal off the worst of the breaches." As they made their way to the lower levels, the rig groaned and shuddered around them. McClary could feel the subtle shift in the structure's balance, a wrongness that set his teeth on edge. They reached the first flooded section, and McClary's heart sank. Water churned ankle-deep, sparks flying from shorted-out electrical systems. But it was the sheen on the water's surface that truly chilled him, an iridescent film that pulsed with alien life. "Christ," Finley muttered. "It's not just water. That's stuff the entity uses. It's mixing with the seawater." McClary nodded grimly. "All the more reason to contain this. We can't let it spread to the upper levels." They waded in, the cold water numbing their legs. McClary tried not to think about what else might be in that water, what changes it might be working on their bodies even now. For the next hour, they fought a desperate battle against the rising tide, sealing breaches where they could, rigging makeshift pumps, sacrificing non-essential systems to save critical ones. But for every victory there seemed to be 2 new crises. Mac Connor's shout cut through the chaos. The main generator room, the waters almost reached it. McClary's blood ran cold. If they lost the main generators, they'd be running on emergency power. And once that ran out, "We need to get down there," he said. "If we can seal it off, maybe we can buy ourselves some more time. The journey to the generator room was a nightmare of twisted metal and rising water. By the time they reached it, the flood had risen to their chests, the cold sapping their strength. The generators loomed before them, massive machines that thrummed with power. But that power was threatened by the encroaching water, now mere inches from the critical components. "We need to build a barrier," McClary shouted over the roar of water and machinery. "Anything we can find, scrap metal, equipment, whatever it takes." They worked feverishly, constructing a makeshift dam around the generators. The water continued to rise, now at their shoulders. McClary could feel the pull of the current, the hungry sea eager to claim them. Just as they were sealing the last section of their improvised barrier, a sound cut through the chaos, a low, reverberating moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What the hell was that?" Finley gasped, his eyes wide with fear. Before McClary could respond, the water around them began to churn and swirl, and from its depths rose a sight that would haunt his nightmares for years to come. A mass of tentacles, glowing with that same alien iridescence, burst from the water. But these were no mere appendages. They writhed and twisted, reshaping themselves before their eyes. And at their centre, a face began to form, a horrible amalgamation of human features and alien geometry. With a start, McClary recognized the distorted visage. "Jesus," he breathed. "Oh God, Jesus, what have you become?" The thing that had once been Jesus regarded them with eyes that glowed with eldritch knowledge. When it spoke, its voice was a cacophony of whispers and screams. "The floodgates are open, Mac. The old world dies and the new world rises. Why do you resist? Why cling to your frail, limited form when transcendence awaits?" The tentacles lashed out, seeking to ensnare them. McClary reacted on instinct, grabbing a piece of broken machinery and swinging it with all his might. The improvised weapon connected with a sickening thud, and the creature that had been Jesus recoiled with an unearthly shriek. "Run!" McClary yelled. "Back to the upper levels, now!" They fled through the rising waters, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. McClary's lungs burned, his muscles screaming in protest, but the alternative, to be caught, to be transformed, drove him on. They reached the emergency bulkhead, slamming it shut behind them. For a moment they stood there, gasping for breath, the sound of pounding tentacles muffled by the thick metal. "Jesus Christ!" Connor wheezed. What was that thing?" McClary shook his head, his mind reeling. "I don't know, but whatever it was, it's not Jesus anymore, and we can't let it reach the upper levels." They made their way back to the control room, leaving a trail of seawater in their wake. The looks on the faces of the crew told McClary all he needed to know. The situation had deteriorated even further in their absence. "Kaz," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Status report." She looked up at him, her eyes haunted. "It's bad, Mac. We've lost almost 40% of the lower levels. The pumps are failing faster than we can repair them. And," she hesitated, "and what? And we're picking up more of those anomalies, like what you encountered down there. They're spreading, Mac. It's like the flooding is helping them move through the rig." McClary closed his eyes, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. They were running out of options, out of time. "Okay," he said, opening his eyes and addressing the room. "We need to face facts. We can't save the entire rig. We need to focus on preserving the essential systems, the areas we absolutely need to survive." He turned to the schematic, pointing to a section near the base of the rig. "The pontoons. If we can reach them, seal them off from the flooding, we might be able to stabilize the rig. Buy ourselves some more time." "That's suicide," Finley protested. "The pontoons are probably already flooded. And after what we just saw down there." McClary met his gaze steadily. "I know. That's why I'm going alone." A chorus of protests erupted, but McClary held up his hand. "This isn't up for debate. I'm not risking anyone else. Kaz, you're in charge up here. Keep doing everything you can to slow the flooding. If I'm not back in 2 hours..." He paused. If I'm not back in 2 hours, seal off the upper levels and prepare for emergency evacuation." As he gathered the equipment he'd need for the descent, McClary found his hand straying to his pocket, to the voice recorder that held Mia's message. For a moment he was tempted to listen to it one last time, but no, that would feel too much like goodbye. Instead, he squared his shoulders and made his way to the access hatch that would take him down to the pontoons. As he prepared to descend into the flooded depths, into the domain of the transformed horrors that had once been his friends, Alistair McClary felt a curious sense of calm settle over him. Whatever waited for him down there, death, transformation, or some fate beyond human comprehension, he would face it head-on. For his crew, for Mia and Lily, for the chance to see the sun rise on a world unchanged by cosmic horror. The hatch closed behind him with a final echoing clang, and Alistair McClary began his descent into the abyss, where the line between human and other, between sanity and madness, blurred like the boundary between sea and sky. Chapter 12. Revelations in the Deep. The descent into the flooded pontoons was a journey into another world. As McClary lowered himself through the access hatch, the icy embrace of the North Sea enveloped him. His dive suit, hastily donned and checked, felt fragile against the crushing pressure of the depths. The beam of his underwater torch carved a weak path through the murky water. Debris floated past, fragments of machinery, torn papers, remnants of the life that had once filled these chambers. But it was the other things, the things that moved with purpose in the shadows beyond his light, that truly chilled McClary to his core. He pushed forward, fighting against the current that seemed to pull him ever deeper. His mission was clear. Reach the main pontoon control room, assess the damage, and, if possible, initiate emergency surfacing procedures. Simple in theory, but down here, in this alien realm of twisted metal and encroaching madness, nothing was simple. As he navigated the flooded corridors, McClary couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Eyes that had never been meant for this world seemed to peer at him from every shadow, every swirl of disturbed silt. He was nearing the control room when he saw it, a flickering, pulsing light emanating from a tear in the hull. Against every instinct of self-preservation, McClary found himself drawn towards it. The breach was larger than he'd expected, a gaping wound in the rig structure that opened out into the vast expanse of the North Sea. But it wasn't the damage that held McClary transfixed. It was what lay beyond. Stretching out into the abyssal darkness was a city, but not a city built by human hands. Its architecture defied Euclidean geometry, towers and spires twisting in ways that hurt the mind to contemplate. Streets and plazas, if they could be called that, wound through the impossible structures like the neural pathways of some vast alien brain, and it was alive. Lights pulsed through the city's veins, a heartbeat of eldritch energy that seemed to call to something deep within McClary's soul. He felt a pull, an urge to swim out into that impossible metropolis, to lose himself in its cosmic wonder. It was the surge of terror that broke the spell. McClary recoiled from the breach, his heart pounding in his ears. But the damage was done. He had seen what lay beneath the waves, had glimpsed the true scale of what they were facing. This wasn't just some sea monster, some localized anomaly. This was a civilization, ancient and vast, that had slumbered beneath the waves for eons. And now, disturbed by humanity's relentless expansion, it was awakening. McClary forced himself to turn away, to focus on his mission. But as he swam towards the control room, his mind reeled with the implications of what he'd seen. The control room, when he reached it, was a scene of devastation. Panels sparked fitfully in the water, displays cracked and dark. But the main console, the one he needed, still showed signs of life. He worked quickly, his fingers clumsy in the thick gloves of his dive suit. Emergency surfacing procedures initiated, backup power rerouted. It wasn't much, but it might buy them some time. As he turned to leave, a movement caught his eye. There, etched into the metal wall of the control room, were symbols. They pulsed with that same otherworldly light he'd seen in the sunken city, and as he watched they began to shift and change. Without conscious thought, McClary found himself reaching out to touch them. The moment his gloved hand made contact, a jolt of energy surged through him, his vision blurred, reality seeming to fold in on itself. He saw flashes of the past, of the entity's arrival on Earth eons ago, of its patient wait through the ages as life evolved in the world above. He saw glimpses of other worlds, of cosmic wars fought with weapons that could reshape reality itself. And he saw the future, a world transformed, humanity evolving into something new, something that could exist in harmony with the entity and its kin. The visions faded, leaving McClary gasping and disoriented, but the knowledge remained, burning in his mind like a brand. A sound behind him snapped him back to the present. He whirled, his torch beam illuminating a sight that froze the blood in his veins. The thing that had once been Jesus hovered in the doorway, its tentacles writhing in the water. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, McClary could see other forms, crewmates he'd thought lost, now twisted and changed into something horrifyingly other. "You see now, don't you, Mac?" The voice echoed in his mind, a chorus of the transformed. "You understand the truth. Why resist? Why cling to your limited form when transcendence awaits?" For a moment, McClary felt the pull. The knowledge imparted by the symbols sang in his veins, whispering of power and understanding beyond human comprehension. To join with the entity, to become part of something vast and eternal. But then another voice cut through the cosmic siren song. Mia's voice from the recorder in his pocket. "We miss you, Alistair. Come home safe to us." The spell broke. McClary kicked hard, propelling himself up and over the transformed horrors. They reached for him, tentacles grasping, but he was faster, driven by a desperation born of love and the will to remain human. The journey back to the upper levels was a blur of terror and determination. More than once, McClary felt the brush of otherworldly appendages against his legs, heard the siren call of the entity in his mind. But he pushed on, focused on one goal: survival. As he burst through the surface in the airlock, gasping and shaking, McClary knew that he had changed. The knowledge imparted by the symbols, the visions of past and future, had altered him in ways he was only beginning to understand. But he was still human, still himself. And as he stumbled into the control room, met by the anxious faces of his remaining crew, he knew that their fight was far from over. Mac Kaz exclaimed, rushing to help him remove his dive helmet. "What happened down there? Did you make it to the pontoon controls?" McClary nodded, his mind still reeling from his otherworldly experience. "I did. Emergency surfacing procedures are initiated. But that's not all I found." Over the next hour, McClary recounted his discoveries, the sunken city, the symbols, the visions they had imparted. He told them of the entity's ancient origins, of its long slumber and recent awakening, and he shared the terrible knowledge of its intentions for humanity. "So what do we do?" Finley asked, his face pale in the harsh light of the control room. "How do we fight something like that?" McClary looked around at the faces of his crew, tired, scared, but still human, still fighting. "We use what we've learned," he said. "The entity is powerful, yes, ancient beyond our comprehension, but it's not infallible. It has weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and now, thanks to what I saw down there, we might just have a chance to exploit them." As the crew huddled around him, McClary began to outline a plan. It was desperate, perhaps even suicidal, but it was a plan born of human ingenuity, of the will to survive against cosmic odds. And as he spoke, as hope began to kindle in the eyes of his crew, Alistair McClary felt a fierce determination take hold. They had seen the face of the abyss, had glimpsed the terrible wonders that lurked in the deep. But they were still here, still human, still fighting. The revelations in the deep had changed everything. But in that change, in the terrible knowledge gained at such cost, there was also opportunity. an opportunity to fight back against the cosmic horror that threatened to reshape their world, an opportunity to prove that humanity, for all its frailty and limitations, would not go quietly into the night. The battle for the future of their world had only just begun. And armed with the knowledge from the deep, they intended to win. Chapter 13. The Betrayal. The control room hummed with nervous energy as McClary outlined his plan. Faces etched with exhaustion and fear looked back at him, a mix of hope and doubt in their eyes. He could see the toll the past days had taken on his crew, the haunted looks, the trembling hands, the way they startled at every unexpected sound. "I know it sounds crazy," McClary said, his voice steady despite his own doubts, "but the symbols I saw down there, the knowledge they imparted, it's given us a chance. A small one, but a chance nonetheless." Kaz leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "You're talking about using the rig itself as a weapon, turning the entity's own energy against it?" McClary nodded. "Exactly. If we can reconfigure the drilling equipment to channel the electromagnetic fields generated by the entity's presence, we might be able to create a feedback loop. Disrupt its ability to maintain cohesion in our reality." A murmur ran through the group. It was a desperate plan, born of cosmic insights that defied human understanding. But it was also the only plan they had. As the discussion continued, McClary noticed Trot hanging back, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The doctor had been quiet since McClary's return, his usual pragmatism replaced by a nervous energy that set McClary's teeth on edge. "Trot," McClary called out, "you've been awfully quiet. What's your take on this?" All eyes turned to the doctor. Trot flinched, as if the attention physically pained him. I'm not sure, Mac. It's a lot to take in. Are we sure this is our only option?" There was something in Trot's voice, a quaver that hadn't been there before. McClary felt a prickle of unease run down his spine. "For now, yes," he replied carefully. "Unless you have another suggestion." Trot shook his head, avoiding eye contact. No, it's just the risks. We're talking about messing with forces we barely understand. What if we make things worse?" McClary was about to respond when an alarm blared through the room. Kaz whirled to her console, her fingers flying over the keys. "We've got a problem," she announced, her voice tight with tension. "The reconfiguration process has started, but something's wrong. The systems are behaving erratically, power fluctuations, data corruption." "Sabotage," Finley growled, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. The realization hit McClary like a physical blow. Someone among them, someone he trusted, had betrayed them. In that moment, as he looked at the faces of his crew, he saw not just fear of the cosmic horror that threatened them, but the all-too-human capacity for betrayal. "Lock down the control room," he ordered, his voice low and dangerous. "No one leaves until we figure this out." As Finley moved to secure the door, a commotion erupted near the back of the room. Trot, his face contorted with a mixture of terror and resolve, had produced a makeshift weapon, a piece of broken machinery, wickedly sharp. "I'm sorry, Mac," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, but I can't let you do this. We have to give in. It's the only way." McClary raised his hands slowly, acutely aware of the volatile situation. "Trot, think about what you're doing. Whatever the entity promised you, whatever it showed you, it's not the truth. It's manipulating you." Trot shook his head violently. "You don't understand. I've seen it, Mac. The future it offers, it's beautiful. Terrifying, yes, but beautiful. We can be part of something greater than ourselves. Why can't you see that?" As Trot spoke, McClary noticed something that chilled him to his core. The doctor's skin seemed to ripple and shift, iridescent patterns forming just beneath the surface. The transformation had already begun. "Trot," McClary said softly, "look at yourself. Look at what it's doing to you. This isn't transcendence, it's corruption." For a moment, doubt flickered in Trot's eyes, but then his face hardened. No, you're wrong, and I won't let you doom us all with your stubbornness." With surprising speed, Trott lunged towards the main console. His intention was clear: to completely sabotage their efforts, to leave them no choice but to submit to the entity's will. What happened next was a blur of motion and shouted orders. Finley and Connor moved to intercept Trott, but the Doctor, empowered by his partial transformation, was unnaturally strong. He fought with the desperation of a man convinced he was saving the world by destroying it. In the chaos, McClary saw his opening. He dove for Trott, tackling him just as the Doctor's hand reached for the critical systems. They went down in a tangle of limbs, McClary fighting not just against Trott's enhanced strength, but against the tendrils of alien influence that seemed to emanate from him. "Stop fighting, Mac," Trott gasped, his voice a mixture of his own and something other. "Join us, see the truth." For a moment, McClary felt the pull. The cosmic knowledge imparted by the symbols sang in his blood, whispering of power and transcendence. But then, as before, Mia's voice cut through the noise. The memory of his family, of his humanity, gave him the strength to resist. With a supreme effort, McClary pinned Trott to the ground. "Kaz," he shouted, "the sedatives from the medbay, now!" Moments later, Trott's struggles began to weaken as the sedative took effect. As the Doctor's eyes fluttered closed, McClary saw a tear roll down his cheek. "I'm sorry," Trott whispered. I thought I was saving us all." With Trott restrained and sedated, the crew turned their attention to damage control. The sabotage had been extensive, but not complete. Critical systems were damaged, but not beyond repair. "How long?" McClary asked Kaz as she assessed the damage. She shook her head, frustration evident in every line of her body. "Hours maybe, if we're lucky, but Mac, even if we fix this, the entity knows what we're planning now. It'll be ready for us." McClary nodded grimly. The betrayal had cost them more than just time and resources. It had cost them the element of surprise, their one real advantage against a foe that could reshape reality itself. As the crew set about repairing the damage, McClary found himself standing by the window, staring out at the implacable sea. The entity was out there, waiting, and now it knew they planned to fight back. He thought of Trott, of the fear and misguided hope that had driven him to betray everything and everyone he knew. How many others among the crew were wrestling with similar temptations? How long before the whispers of cosmic transcendence became too loud to ignore? McClary's hand went to his pocket, to the voice recorder that held Mia's message. He didn't play it. He didn't need to. The memory of her voice, of their life together, was enough to strengthen his resolve. They would fight. Not just against the cosmic horror that threatened to remake their world, but against the all-too-human weaknesses that made them vulnerable to its influence. They would fight with every ounce of their humanity, with every scrap of ingenuity and determination they possessed. Because in the end, that humanity, flawed, fragile but fiercely resilient, was the one thing the entity couldn't comprehend. And in that lack of understanding lay their only hope of victory. As McClary turned back to his crew, to the monumental task that lay ahead, he felt a fierce determination take hold. The betrayal had shaken them, yes, but it had also shown them the true nature of their fight. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a battle for the very essence of what made them human. And it was a battle they intended to win, no matter the cost. Chapter 14. Race against time, the rig groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from its very bones. McClary felt the vibration through the soles of his feet, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. Time, that most precious and unforgiving of resources, was running out. "Status report," he barked, striding into the control room. The faces that turned to meet him were etched with exhaustion and fear, but there was a determination there too. They had come too far, endured too much, to give up now. Kaz's fingers flew over her keyboard, her eyes never leaving the screens before her. "It's not good, Mac," she said, her voice tight with tension. "The sabotage did more damage than we initially thought. We've got multiple systems on the verge of failure, and the structural integrity of the lower levels is compromised. How long? McClary asked, dreading the answer. Kaz shook her head. At this rate, maybe 3 hours before we lose critical systems. Less if the entity decides to make another push. McClary nodded, his mind racing. 3 hours to save the rig, to execute their desperate plan to somehow survive against a force that defied human comprehension. Right, he said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. We split into teams. Kaz, you stay here and coordinate. Finley, you're with me. We're heading to the lower levels to shore up the structural supports. Connor, take a team and focus on getting the power systems stabilized. We need every watt we can muster for this to work. As the crew dispersed to their tasks, McClary caught a glimpse of his reflection in a darkened monitor. The man who stared back at him was barely recognizable, gaunt, haunted, eyes burning with a mixture of determination and something else. Something that hadn't been there before his encounter with the entity's symbols. He pushed the thought aside. There would be time for self-reflection later, if they survived. The journey to the lower levels was a descent into chaos. Emergency lights flickered, casting writhing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of seawater and ozone, and beneath it all, a hint of something else. Something alien. Watch your step, McClary warned as they navigated a particularly treacherous section. And keep an eye out for... His words were cut short by a sound that chilled him to his core, a wet, slithering noise followed by an inhuman moan that seemed to resonate with the rig's own groans. Mac, Finley whispered, his voice tight with fear. Please tell me that was just the wind. McClary shook his head grimly. You know it wasn't. Be ready for anything. They pressed on, the sounds growing louder, more frequent. The entity's influence was strong here, in these liminal spaces where the border between their world and its realm grew thin. They reached the main support structure, and McClary's heart sank. The massive beams that held the rig aloft were buckling, stressed beyond their limits by the sabotage and the relentless assault of the sea. We need to reinforce these, he said, already moving towards the emergency repair kit. If these go, the whole rig goes with them. They worked feverishly, welding support struts and applying quick-setting composite to the weakest points. All the while, the sounds of otherworldly movement grew closer. Mac, Finley's voice was barely above a whisper. We've got company. McClary turned and felt his blood run cold. There, at the end of the corridor, was a sight that defied description. It moved like liquid, but had the solidity of flesh. Tendrils and pseudopods reached out, tasting the air, seeking them, and at its core, barely recognizable, was a face. Trott's face. Oh, God, Finley breathed. Is that? McClary nodded grimly. What's left of him? The entity. It's using him, using all of them. The thing that had been Trott surged forward with terrifying speed. McClary reacted on instinct, grabbing a pressurized welding canister and hurling it at the creature. The canister exploded on impact, filling the corridor with choking fumes. Run! McClary shouted, grabbing Finley's arm. They fled through the maze of corridors, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. They burst into a maintenance room, slamming the door shut behind them. For a moment all they could do was stand there, gasping for breath. That was too close, Finley panted. How? How are we supposed to fight that? Before McClary could respond, his radio crackled to life. Kaz's voice came through, tight with urgency. Mac, we've got a problem. The entity, it's making a push. We're seeing activity all over the rig. And the power systems are fluctuating. Whatever you're going to do, you need to do it fast. McClary shared a look with Finley. The clock was ticking and they were running out of options. We need to get back to the control room, McClary said. If we're going to have any chance of pulling this off, we need to coordinate our efforts. The journey back was a nightmare of near misses and terrifying encounters. The entity's influence was spreading, transforming sections of the rig into impossible geometries that hurt the mind to look upon. More than once they had to backtrack and find alternate routes as corridors twisted into non-Euclidean shapes before their eyes. When they finally reached the control room, they found it a hive of frantic activity. Kaz was at the centre of it all, directing efforts and monitoring systems with a focus that bordered on manic. "Talk to me," McClary said as he strode in. Kaz looked up, relief washing over her face. "You made it. Good. We're on the edge, Mac. Power systems are barely holding. The structural reinforcements you applied are helping, but they won't last long. And the entity. It's like it knows what we're planning. It's targeting key systems, trying to shut us down before we can act." McClary nodded, his mind racing. They were out of time, out of options. It was now or never. "All right," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos of the control room. "This is it. We've got one shot at this. Kaz, begin the power-up sequence for the drilling equipment. Finley, I need you on damage control. Anything that looks like it's about to fail, you keep it running, whatever it takes. Connor, you're our eyes and ears. Monitor the entity's movements. Give us warning if it makes a big push." As the crew rushed to their stations, McClary found himself standing before the main console. The plan they had cobbled together from his cosmic visions and their human ingenuity was insane. A Hail Mary pass in a game where the stakes were the fate of humanity. But it was all they had. He began the activation sequence, his fingers flying over the controls with a certainty that came from somewhere beyond his conscious mind. As the rig's systems came online, reconfigured to channel and redirect the entity's own energy, he felt a change in the air. A charge, like the moment before a lightning strike. The entity felt it too. All around them, alarms blared as it launched a full-scale assault on the rig. Transformed horrors that had once been human threw themselves at barriers and airlocks. The sea itself seemed to rise up, massive tentacles of water slamming against the rig's legs. "Hold on!" McClary shouted as the rig shuddered under the onslaught. "Just a few more seconds." The air crackled with eldritch energy. Reality itself seemed to warp and bend around them. For a moment, McClary thought he could see through the walls of the control room into realms beyond human comprehension. And then, with a sound that was felt more than heard, the reconfigured drilling equipment activated. A beam of pure energy, born of human technology and cosmic horror, lanced out into the depths. The entity's assault faltered. A psychic scream echoed through their minds, a sound of rage and pain and fear. "It's working!" Kaz yelled over the cacophony of alarms and groaning metal. "The energy readings are off the charts. We're disrupting its cohesion." For a moment, hope flared in McClary's chest. They had done it. They had found a way to fight back against the cosmic horror that threatened to remake their world. But then, as the rig shuddered and groaned around them, as the sea churned with otherworldly energies, McClary realized a terrible truth. They might have hurt the entity, but in doing so, they had also sealed their own fate. The rig was coming apart at the seams, torn between the forces of their jury-rigged weapon and the entity's dying throes. They had won the battle. But as the floor began to tilt beneath their feet, as the sound of tearing metal filled the air, Alistair McClary faced the very real possibility that victory had come at the cost of their lives. The race against time was over. Now it was a race for survival. And as the North Sea rose up to claim them, McClary could only hope that their sacrifice would be enough to save the world they had fought so hard to protect. Chapter 15. The Heart of Darkness. The rig groaned and shuddered, a dying leviathan in its death throes. Alarms blared from every direction, their urgent wails a discordant symphony of impending doom. In the chaos of the control room, as his crew fought desperately to stabilize what remained of their floating world, McClary made a decision that he knew might be his last. "I'm going down there," he announced, his voice cutting through the pandemonium. Finley's head snapped up, disbelief etched on his weathered face. "Are you insane? The lower levels are completely compromised. It's suicide." McClary met his friend's gaze steadily. "We hurt it, Finley, but it's not dead, and as long as it lives, none of this ends." He gestured to the screens showing the entity's continued assault on the rig. "Someone has to go to the source." To finish this, understanding dawned in Finley's eyes, followed quickly by resignation. "You're not coming back from this, are you, Mac?" McClary managed a grim smile. "That's the plan. But when has anything gone according to plan lately?" As he prepared to descend into the bowels of the rig, into the very heart of the entity's influence, McClary found his hand straying to his pocket, to the voice recorder that held Mia's message. For a moment he was tempted to listen to it one last time. But no, that would feel too much like goodbye. Instead, he squared his shoulders and made his way to the access hatch that would take him down to the abyss. As the hatch sealed behind him with a final echoing clang, Alistair McClary began his descent into madness. The lower levels of the rig were a nightmare realm of twisted metal and impossible geometries. Corridors stretched and contracted, defying the laws of physics. Shadows moved with purpose, reaching out with tendrils that seemed both solid and insubstantial. McClary pushed forward, each step a battle against the very fabric of reality that sought to unmake him. The air grew thick, filled with an oily mist that clung to his skin and burned in his lungs, and all around, always, was the sound, a pulsing, rhythmic thrum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He reached a chamber that had once been the main pump room. Now it was a vast cavern that stretched far beyond the physical limits of the rig, and there, at its centre, waited the entity. It was beautiful, in the way that a supernova or a black hole is beautiful, a cosmic force of such immensity that the human mind could barely comprehend it. Its form shifted constantly, one moment a writhing mass of tentacles, the next a being of pure energy, then something else entirely, something that hurt the eyes and mind to look upon. "Alistair McClary!" It spoke, its voice a chorus of whispers and screams that echoed in McClary's skull. "You have come to us at last." McClary stood his ground, fighting against the urge to flee, to prostrate himself before this cosmic horror. "I've come to end this," he said, his voice sounding small and insignificant in the vast chamber. The entity's laughter was the sound of galaxies colliding. "End this. Foolish, limited creature. We are eternal. We are inevitable. We are the end and the beginning." As it spoke, the chamber around them began to shift and change. McClary found himself standing not in the bowels of an oil rig, but on a vast plain under an alien sky. Impossible cities rose in the distance, their spires twisting in ways that defied Euclidean geometry. "This is but one of the worlds we have remade," the entity's voice reverberated through him. "One of the civilizations we have uplifted from the mire of their limitations." The scene changed again. Now McClary stood in a familiar street, his street, back home. But it was wrong, twisted. The houses were made of writhing flesh, windows like lidless eyes staring out at him. And the people. He recoiled in horror as he saw his neighbours, his friends, transformed into hybrid monstrosities that were neither fully human nor fully other. They reached out to him with limbs that were not limbs, their faces a mockery of the people he once knew. "This is the future we offer," the entity whispered, its voice now somehow intimate, seductive. "A future where humanity transcends its frail flesh, where you become more than you ever dreamed possible." The visions assaulted McClary's mind, each more terrible and wondrous than the last. He saw the earth transformed, humanity evolved into beings of pure energy and thought. He saw the stars themselves reshaped by the will of these new gods. And through it all he felt the pull, the whisper of cosmic power, of knowledge beyond mortal ken. It would be so easy to give in, to accept the entity's offer and become something more than human. But then, cutting through the cosmic siren song, came another voice. Mia's voice from the recorder in his pocket. "We miss you, Alistair. Come home safe to us." The spell broke. McClary gasped, finding himself back in the twisted chamber of the rig. The entity loomed before him, its form now a roiling mass of darkness shot through with points of light like distant stars. "No," McClary said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "No, I reject your future. I reject your transcendence. Humanity may be flawed, may be limited, but it's our flaws, our struggles that make us who we are." The entity's rage was palpable, a psychic force that threatened to overwhelm McClary's mind. "You would condemn your species to extinction, to irrelevance in the cosmic order." McClary stood firm, drawing strength from the memory of Mia's voice, from the thought of his daughter, of all the small, precious moments that made life worth living. "I would condemn us to be human, to live, to love, to struggle and grow on our own terms." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a device he had cobbled together from the rig's systems and the knowledge imparted by the entity's own symbols. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all he had. "You say you're eternal," McClary said, his finger hovering over the activation switch. "Let's test that theory." The device hummed to life, emitting a frequency that made reality itself seem to ripple and warp. The entity recoiled, its form fluctuating wildly. "What have you done?" it roared, its voice now tinged with something McClary had never expected to hear from a cosmic being: fear. "Fighting fire with fire," McClary grinned, though there was no humour in it, or in this case, fighting cosmic horror with its own principles. "This device is channeling the same energy you use to reshape reality, but focused, concentrated, a quantum scalpel, if you will." The chamber began to collapse around them as the device's energy interfered with the entity's hold on reality. The rig groaned and shuddered, tearing itself apart at the seams. McClary knew he should run, should try to escape. But he stood his ground, holding the device steady as the world fell apart around him. He thought of Mia, of their daughter, of the world he was fighting to protect. "This ends now," he said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of destruction. As darkness closed in, as the heart of the entity's power collapsed in on itself, Alistair McClary closed his eyes and thought of home. The last thing he heard before consciousness fled was a sound he never expected to hear from a cosmic god, a scream. Chapter 16. Loss and sacrifice the world returned to McClary in fragments, the taste of blood in his mouth, the sting of salt water in his eyes, the ache of bruised and battered flesh. He gasped, choking on the thick, oily air that filled his lungs. Mac, can you hear me?" The voice seemed to come from far away, distorted as if travelling through water. McClary forced his eyes open, blinking against the harsh glare of emergency lighting. Finley's face swam into view, etched with concern and something else. A deep, haunting sorrow. "Finn!" McClary croaked, his voice barely recognizable. "What? What happened?" Finley helped him sit up and McClary's world spun sickeningly. They were in what remained of the lower levels, surrounded by twisted metal and sparking wires. The entity's chamber was gone, collapsed in on itself like a failed singularity. "You did it, Mac," Finley said, his voice thick with emotion. "That device of yours, it worked. The entity, well, we're not sure if it's dead, but it's gone. Retreated, maybe. But the rig." McClary looked around, really taking in their surroundings for the first time. The destruction was total. What remained of the rig was barely holding together, groaning and creaking ominously. "How did I survive?" McClary asked, the question burning in his mind. "I was at the epicenter. I should be." Finley's face crumpled, and McClary felt his heart sink. "Connor," Finley said, the name coming out as barely more than a whisper. He came after you, said he couldn't let you face that thing alone. He found you just as everything was collapsing. Shielded you with his own body." The words hit McClary like a physical blow. Connor, brave, loyal Connor, who had followed him into hell without hesitation, who had given his life so that McClary might live. "Where is he?" McClary asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it. Finley shook his head, tears streaming down his weathered face. "We couldn't. There wasn't anything left to recover. The collapse, the flooding. He's gone, Mac. Really gone. The weight of it all crashed down on McClary. Connor's sacrifice, the destruction of the rig, the countless lives lost in their battle against cosmic horror. He had made the choices, given the orders that led them here. The responsibility sat on his shoulders like a physical weight, threatening to crush him. The others, he managed to ask. Most made it to the upper levels, Finlay replied. Kaz is coordinating rescue efforts. But we've lost. We've lost a lot of good people. Mac McClary struggled to his feet, swaying as the rig shifted beneath them. We need to get to the others. Need to. His words trailed off as the full impact of their situation hit him. They were stranded in the middle of the North Sea, on a rig that was falling apart around them. The entity might be gone, but the danger was far from over. As they made their way through the wreckage of the lower levels, McClary saw the cost of their victory written in twisted metal and dark stains that he tried not to think too hard about. Every step was a reminder of the lives lost, the sacrifices made. They reached what remained of the control room to find a scene of organized chaos. Kaz was at the center of it all, issuing orders and coordinating their dwindling resources with a focus that bordered on mania. She looked up as they entered, relief washing over her face. Mac, thank God, we thought, when Connor didn't come back. The mention of Connor's name sent a fresh wave of pain through McClary. He saw it reflected in Kaz's eyes, in the slump of her shoulders. What's our status? He asked, forcing himself to focus on the immediate problems. Kaz's report was grim. The rig was barely holding together. Life support systems were failing. Their communications were down. And the sea, still churning with the after-effects of their battle with the entity, made any hope of rescue seem like a distant dream. As McClary listened, he felt the weight of leadership settling back onto his shoulders. These people, what remained of his crew, were looking to him for guidance, for hope. Even now, after everything they'd been through, they still turned to him. The guilt threatened to overwhelm him. How many had died following his orders? How many families would never see their loved ones again because of the choices he'd made? Mac Finley's voice cut through his spiral of self-recrimination. What do we do now? McClary looked around at the faces of his surviving crew, tired, scared, but still looking to him with trust in their eyes. He thought of Connor, of his sacrifice, of all the others who had given their lives in this fight against cosmic horror. He couldn't let their sacrifices be in vain. We survive, he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. We've beaten the entity, pushed it back. Now we need to make sure there's a world left to save. Kaz, focus all our remaining power on life support and structural integrity. Finlay, I want damage control teams checking every level, securing what we can. Everyone else start gathering supplies, food, water, medical equipment, anything we might need. As the crew sprang into action, energized by the clear orders and the glimmer of hope they provided, McClary found himself drawn to the window. The North Sea stretched out before him, dark and tempestuous. Somewhere out there, rescue might be coming, or perhaps the entity was regrouping, preparing for another assault. He reached into his pocket, fingers closing around the voice recorder. Mia's voice, a lifeline in the darkness. He didn't play it. He didn't need to. The memory of her words, of their life together, was enough. I'm sorry, Connor, he whispered to the uncaring sea. I'm sorry to all of you. Your sacrifices, they won't be forgotten. They won't be in vain. A hand on his shoulder startled him from his reverie. It was Kaz, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. It's not your fault, Mac, she said softly. Connor, the others, they made their choices. We all did. We knew the risks. McClary nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Kaz squeezed his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and shared grief. We're not done yet, she continued. There's still a lot of fight left in this crew. In you. Connor believed in you. We all do. Don't let the guilt drag you down. Honor their sacrifices by getting the rest of us home. Her words struck a chord in McClary, cutting through the fog of guilt and grief. She was right. There would be time for mourning later. For now, they had to focus on survival, on making sure that the sacrifices of Connor and all the others meant something. As he turned back to the control room, to the monumental task of keeping what remained of their battered rig afloat, McClary felt a shift within himself. The weight of loss and sacrifice was still there, a burden he would carry for the rest of his days. But alongside it was a fierce determination. They had faced the darkness at the heart of reality and emerged, battered but unbroken. They had pushed back against forces that defied human comprehension. And they had done it not through cosmic power or eldritch knowledge, but through very human qualities, courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the face of adversity. Whatever challenges lay ahead, be they the wrath of the sea, the return of the entity, or the long road of healing that awaited them all, they would face them together, united by their shared loss, their shared struggle, and their shared humanity. For Connor, for all those they had lost, for the world they had fought so hard to protect, they would endure. They would survive. They would remember. Chapter 17, the plan the control room had become a war chamber. Its screens flickering with damage reports and structural diagrams instead of the usual drilling data. McClary stood at its center, his haunted eyes scanning the assembled faces of his remaining crew. The losses they had suffered weighed heavily on all of them, but there was a spark of determination in their gazes that gave him hope. "All right," McClary began, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. "We've pushed the entity back, but we can't assume it's gone for good, and even if it is, we're still in a hell of a situation." Kaz nodded grimly from her station. "The rig's integrity is compromised on multiple levels. We're running on emergency power, and our supplies are limited. Not to mention the storm brewing out there." As if on cue, a rumble of thunder shook the rig, causing everyone to glance nervously at the windows where dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. McClary took a deep breath, centering himself. "Which is why we need a plan, not just to survive, but to end this. Once and for all." He moved to the main console, pulling up the schematics of the rig alongside the data they had gathered on the entity. As he spoke, his fingers flew over the controls, highlighting key areas and systems. The entity, for all its cosmic power, operates on principles we can understand at least partially. It manipulates energy, bends reality, but it's not infallible. We hurt it before, and we can hurt it again. Finley leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What are you thinking?" McClary's eyes gleamed with a mixture of desperation and inspiration. "We turn the entire rig into a weapon. A beacon, if you will, that can disrupt the entity's ability to maintain cohesion in our reality." He began to outline his plan, drawing on the knowledge imparted by the entity's symbols and his own desperate ingenuity. They would reconfigure the rig's remaining systems, power, communications, even the drilling equipment, into a massive version of the device he had used in the heart of darkness. "It's insane," Kaz breathed, but there was a note of awe in her voice. "Using the rig's own structural resonance to amplify the effect. It just might work. Or it might tear us apart," Finley added, though he was already nodding along. "But it's not like we have a lot of options." McClary looked at each of them in turn. "I won't lie to you. This is a long shot, and it's going to be dangerous. If anyone wants to opt out, to focus on conventional survival or rescue options, I won't hold it against you." A moment of silence fell over the room. Then, one by one, the crew members stepped forward, volunteering for the various tasks needed to bring this desperate plan to fruition. "For Connor," someone said softly, and the name was echoed around the room, a reminder of what they had lost and what they were fighting for. With renewed purpose, they set to work. The next hours were a blur of frantic activity, a race against time and the elements. Kaz coordinated from the control room, her fingers flying over keyboards as she reprogrammed systems and rerouted power. Finley led teams through the treacherous lower levels, salvaging equipment and reinforcing critical structures. McClary found himself everywhere at once, overseeing the construction of improvised components, solving unexpected problems, and providing the push needed to keep everyone going when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. Throughout it all, the rig groaned and shuddered around them. Alarms blared constantly, warning of new breaches, failing systems, and the ever-present threat of collapse. The storm outside intensified, massive waves battering the already weakened structure. During a rare moment of respite, McClary found himself standing by the window, staring out at the roiling sea. The voice recorder weighed heavy in his pocket, a reminder of everything he was fighting for. "You'd think I was crazy if you could see me now, Mia," he murmured. "Hell, maybe I am crazy, but I made a promise. To come home, to all of us coming home." A particularly violent wave struck the rig, causing it to lurch sickeningly. McClary steadied himself against the window frame, his resolve hardening. They were running out of time. He returned to the control room to find Kaz hunched over a console, frustration evident in every line of her body. "What's wrong?" he asked, dread coiling in his stomach. Kaz looked up, her face pale with exhaustion and worry. "The calculations. They're not adding up, Mac. We're missing something. Some crucial component to make this work." McClary leaned in, scanning the data. She was right. Their jerry-rigged system was impressive, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of cosmic horror. But it wasn't enough. They needed something more, something to tie it all together and give it the power to truly affect the entity. As he stared at the screens, at the schematics of their cobbled-together weapon, a thought began to form. A terrible, beautiful thought that sent a chill down his spine, even as it filled him with a grim sense of purpose. "I know what we're missing," he said softly. Kaz looked at him, hope and fear warring in her eyes. "What is it, Mac?" McClary straightened, his decision made. "Me. We're missing me." Confusion flickered across Kaz's face, quickly replaced by horror as understanding dawned. "No, Mac, no, you can't be serious." But he was. In that moment, with clarity born of desperation and cosmic insight, Alistair McClary knew what had to be done. "The entity changed me, Kaz. When I interfaced with its symbols, when I faced it in the heart of darkness. I'm connected to it now, in ways I don't fully understand. If I can use that connection, channel it through our system." "It'll kill you," Kaz whispered, tears welling in her eyes. McClary nodded, a sad smile touching his lips. "Probably, but it might just be enough to finish this. To make sure that thing can never threaten our world again." Before Kaz could protest further, another alarm blared. Finley's voice came over the comms, tight with urgency. "Mac, we've got a problem. The lower levels, they're flooding again. But it's not seawater. It's that stuff, the entity's substance. It's like it's trying to reclaim the rig." McClary's jaw tightened. They were out of time, out of options. "Finish the preparations," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I'll be in position when it's time." As he strode from the control room, McClary felt a curious sense of calm settle over him. The fear was still there, the grief for all they had lost, the ache of leaving behind those he loved. But stronger than all of that was a sense of purpose. He had started this, had led his crew into the maw of cosmic horror. Now he would end it, whatever the cost. As the rig shuddered and groaned around him, as the entity's influence crept ever closer, Alistair McClary prepared to make his final stand. Not just for his crew or for Mia and their daughter, but for all of humanity. The plan was in motion. The pieces were in place. All that remained was the sacrifice to set it all in motion. Chapter 18. Into the Abyss. The submersible groaned as it descended into the inky blackness of the North Sea. McClary sat at the controls, his face illuminated by the soft glow of instrument panels. Beside him, Finley checked and rechecked their makeshift equipment, his movements betraying a nervous energy. "You don't have to do this, you know," Finley said, breaking the tense silence. "We could still abort, try to wait for rescue." McClary shook his head, eyes fixed on the depth gauge. "You know we can't, Finn. This ends now, one way or another." Their plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. With the rig reconfigured into a massive disruptor array, they needed to get to the source, the entity's underwater stronghold, to trigger the device. And McClary, with his unique connection to the cosmic horror, would serve as both trigger and targeting system. As they descended deeper, the pressure outside the submersible's hull increased exponentially. Metal creaked and popped, the sounds amplified in the confined space. 1,000 meters, Finley announced, his voice tight. "We're well beyond the rig's operational depth now." McClary nodded grimly. They were in uncharted territory, both literally and figuratively. The blueprints for their mission existed only in the fractured visions imparted by the entity's symbols and McClary's own intuition. Suddenly, the submersible lurched violently. Warning lights flashed across the console as they were pulled into a powerful current. "What the hell?" Finley exclaimed, gripping his seat. McClary fought with the controls, his face a mask of concentration. "It's the entity. It knows we're here. It's trying to stop us." The current grew stronger, threatening to tear their fragile craft apart. Through the viewports, McClary caught glimpses of impossible shapes moving in the darkness, tentacles the size of skyscrapers, structures that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that defied physics. And then, as suddenly as it began, the turbulence ceased. The submersible drifted to a stop, suspended in water that glowed with an eerie bioluminescent light. Before them loomed a sight that defied comprehension. A vast underwater city, its architecture an alien blend of organic and geometric forms. Towers spiraled impossibly upward, their surfaces alive with pulsing otherworldly energy. Streets and plazas, if they could be called that, wound through the structure like the neural pathways of some vast cosmic brain. "My God," Finley breathed, his face pale in the ethereal light. It's beautiful." McClary felt it too, the pull of cosmic wonder, the siren song of knowledge beyond human ken. But beneath that beauty lurked a terrible alien hunger, a desire to reshape all of reality in its own image. "Remember why we're here," McClary said, as much to himself as to Finley. "That thing up there, it wants to end everything we know, everything we love." They guided the submersible towards what seemed to be the city's central structure, a massive, pulsing orb that hurt the eyes to look at directly. As they drew closer, McClary felt a pressure building in his mind. The entity was aware of them, its vast consciousness focusing on their tiny craft. Alistair McClary, its voice resonated in his skull. "You returned to us. Have you reconsidered our offer?" McClary gritted his teeth against the psychic assault. "Not a chance. We're here to end this." The entity's amusement was a palpable thing, a cosmic laugh that threatened to shatter reality. "You cannot end us, little one. We are eternal. We are inevitable." But as it spoke, McClary sensed something beneath its bravado. A flicker of uncertainty, fear. In that moment he understood. The entity, for all its power, for all its cosmic nature, was not omnipotent. It could be hurt. It could be driven back. It could be defeated. "Finley," McClary said, his voice steady despite the maelstrom of emotions and alien influences swirling within him, "initiate the sequence. It's time." As Finley began the activation process for their cobbled-together device, McClary closed his eyes, focusing on the connection that had been forged between him and the entity. He felt it pull at him, trying to subsume his consciousness into its vast, alien mindscape. But McClary held firm, anchoring himself in memories of home, of Mia and their daughter, of the crew that had sacrificed so much to get them here. He became a conduit, channeling the energy of the rig's disruptor array through his own being and into the heart of the entity's domain. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Reality itself seemed to buckle and warp around them. The beautiful, terrible city began to twist and dissolve, its impossible geometries collapsing in on themselves. The entity's scream was beyond sound, beyond thought. It was the cry of a cosmic being facing its own mortality for the first time in eons. This cannot be. It raged in McClary's mind. We are eternal. We are... You're finished, McClary growled through gritted teeth, pushing back against the entity's influence with every ounce of his humanity. The submersible shuddered and groaned, threatening to implode under the stress of energies never meant for this reality. Warning alarms blared as systems failed one by one. Mac Finley shouted over the cacophony, "We need to go. This whole place is coming apart." But McClary knew he couldn't leave. Not yet. The entity was wounded, yes, but not destroyed. If he broke the connection now, it might yet survive, might yet return to threaten everything he loved. "Get to the escape pod," he ordered, his voice strained with effort. "I need to finish this." Finley's protest was drowned out by another psychic scream from the entity. The submersible's viewport cracked, a thin stream of water beginning to spray into the cabin. "Go!" McClary roared, using the last of his strength to shove Finley towards the escape pod. "Tell Mia! Tell her I'm sorry, and that I love her." The last thing he saw was Finley's anguished face as the escape pod door sealed shut. Then McClary turned back to face the disintegrating alien city, to the cosmic horror that had haunted his dreams and threatened his world. As water began to fill the cabin, as the pressure threatened to crush him, Alistair McClary smiled. He thought of Mia, of their daughter, of the world he was saving, of Connor and all the others who had sacrificed themselves to get them to this point. "This is for them," he whispered. "This is for all of us." With a final Herculean effort, McClary pushed everything he had into the connection. His memories, his hopes, his very essence, all of it became a weapon against the cosmic entity. The last thing he heard, before darkness claimed him, was the entity's final, fading cry, "We. We are undone." And then there was only the abyss. But it was an abyss free of cosmic horror, an abyss that promised nothing more than the natural darkness of the deep sea. As consciousness slipped away, Alistair McClary knew that he had won. That humanity, with all its flaws and limitations, had stood against the vastness of cosmic terror and emerged victorious. His last thought, as the sea claimed him, was of home. Chapter 19, the final stand. The escape pod burst through the surface of the North Sea, bobbing violently in the storm-tossed waves. Finley, battered and disoriented, struggled to make sense of his surroundings. The pod's small window showed only darkness and driving rain. "Mac!" he gasped, the reality of what had just transpired hitting him like a physical blow. "Oh, God, Mac!" His radio crackled to life, Kaz's voice cutting through his grief. Finley, do you read? What's happening down there?" Finley fumbled with the controls, his hands shaking. "Kaz! It's McClary, Before he could finish, a tremor ran through the water. The sea around the pod began to churn and boil, as if some massive force was rising from the depths. "No," Finley breathed, his eyes wide with horror. "It can't be." But it was. Rising from the abyss came a sight that defied comprehension. The entity, or some manifestation of it, erupted from the sea. It was a writhing mass of tentacles and impossible geometries, its form shifting and changing with each passing second. And at its core, trapped within a cage of otherworldly energy, was McClary. Back on the rig, Kaz and the remaining crew watched in stunned silence as their sensors picked up the massive disturbance. The main screen showed a nightmarish amalgamation of flesh and cosmic power rising towards their battered structure. "It's still alive," someone whispered, voice thick with terror. Kaz gripped the edge of her console, her mind racing. The plan, it wasn't enough. We need to do something fast. As the entity rose, its vast consciousness pressed down on them all. Thoughts that were not their own invaded their minds, promises of power and transcendence mixed with threats of cosmic retribution. "Foolish creatures," its voice resonated in their skulls. "You thought to destroy us. We are eternal. We are inevitable. Inside his energy cage, McClary struggled against the entity's hold. He could feel it trying to subsume him, to use his connection to it as a conduit to fully enter their reality. But he fought back with everything he had, clinging to his humanity with grim determination. "Kaz," he managed to broadcast, his voice weak but resolute. "The device, it weakened it. But we need more. We need." His voice cut off as the entity tightened its grip, sending waves of pain through his body. On the rig, Kaz's eyes widened in sudden understanding. "The rig," she breathed. "We need to use the entire rig." She turned to the crew, her voice rising with urgency. "Listen up. We're going to overload every system we've got. Power, communications, everything. Channel it all into the disruptor array. We'll turn this entire structure into one massive weapon." As the crew sprang into action, Finley's voice came over the radio. "What about Mac? We can't just leave him out there." Kaz closed her eyes, the weight of command settling heavily on her shoulders. "We don't have a choice." Finn Mac knew the risks. "We have to finish this, or everything he's sacrificed will be for nothing." The entity continued to rise, its vast bulk now looming over the rig. Tentacles of impossible matter lashed out, smashing through barriers and tearing into the structure. The rig groaned and shuddered, teetering on the brink of collapse. Inside his prison, McClary felt the entity's triumph, its certainty of victory. But he also sensed something else, a weakness, born of its brush with true vulnerability. It was afraid, and in that fear, McClary saw their chance. "Kaz," he broadcast, fighting through waves of pain, "when I give the signal, hit it with everything we've got, and I'm sorry. For everything." Before Kaz could respond, McClary closed his eyes and opened himself fully to the connection with the entity. But instead of fighting it, he embraced it. He let the cosmic horror flow through him, into him. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The entity recoiled, its form rippling with confusion and something akin to pain. It had expected resistance, had prepared for it. But this willing embrace, this acceptance, was something it couldn't comprehend. Now, McClary's voice, amplified by his connection to the entity, boomed in the minds of the entire crew. Kaz slammed her hand down on the activation sequence. Every system on the rig surged into overdrive. Power conduits overloaded, communications arrays burned out, and the makeshift disruptor beam blazed to life with an intensity that threatened to tear the rig apart. The beam struck the entity dead center, passing through McClary's body on its way. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, nothing happened. The entity's assault paused as if in confusion. Then, with a sound that defied description, reality itself seemed to fracture. The entity's form began to unravel, cosmic energies spiraling out of control. Its scream was beyond sound, beyond thought, the death cry of something that had thought itself immortal. As the entity disintegrated, McClary felt himself falling. The cage of energy that had held him dissipated, and he plunged towards the churning sea. In those last moments of consciousness, he thought of Mia, of their daughter, of the world he had fought so hard to save. "I'm coming home," he whispered, though whether to himself or to the universe at large he couldn't say. Then the sea closed over him, and darkness claimed Alistair McClary. On the rig, as the last echoes of the entity's death throes faded, an eerie calm descended. The crew stood in stunned silence, unable to fully process what they had just witnessed, what they had just accomplished. It was Finley who broke the silence, his voice crackling over the radio. Is it over? Did we win?" Kaz looked at the screens, at the readings that showed no trace of the cosmic anomalies that had plagued them for so long. She thought of McClary, of his sacrifice, of all they had lost to get to this point. "Yeah," she said softly, a single tear tracking down her cheek. "Yeah, Finn, we won." As the realization sank in, as the enormity of their victory against cosmic horror began to register, a cheer went up from the battered crew. They had faced the unimaginable, had stared into the abyss of cosmic terror, and had emerged victorious. But for Kaz, for Finley, for all those who had known McClary, the victory was bittersweet. They had saved the world, yes, but at what cost? As rescue ships appeared on the horizon, drawn by their distress signals, Kaz found herself staring out at the now calm sea. Somewhere out there beneath the waves lay the body of Alistair McClary, a man who had faced cosmic horror with nothing but his humanity and his indomitable will. "Goodbye, Mac," she whispered, "and thank you." The sun began to rise, its light chasing away the last remnants of the storm. A new day was dawning, a day free from the shadow of cosmic terror, a day bought and paid for by the courage and sacrifice of those who had stood against the darkness. The final stand was over. Humanity had prevailed. And though the cost had been high, the world would go on, blissfully unaware of how close it had come to unimaginable horror. For the crew of the Brent Charlie, survivors of cosmic terror, the true challenge was just beginning, learning to live in a world forever changed by what they had experienced, and honouring the memory of those who had given everything to keep that world turning. Chapter 20, Aftermath. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a surreal golden glow over the battered remains of the Brent Charlie. The rig, once a towering feat of human engineering, now stood as a twisted monument to a battle unseen and uncomprehended by the rest of the world. Kaz stood on what was left of the helipad, her eyes scanning the turbulent waters below. Rescue ships were approaching, their lights piercing through the lingering mist. She should have felt relief, triumph even. They had faced an incomprehensible cosmic horror and emerged victorious. Yet all she felt was a bone-deep weariness and a gnawing sense of unease. Any sign of him? Finley's voice came from behind her, hope and desperation warring in his tone. Kaz shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. They both knew the chances of finding McClary alive were virtually non-existent. But giving up the search felt like a betrayal of everything he had sacrificed for them. "We'll keep looking," she finally managed, turning to face Finley. The sight of him made her breath catch in her throat. In the harsh light of day, the toll of their ordeal was starkly visible. Cuts, bruises, and an age that went beyond mere physical years marked his face. Kaz Connor's voice crackled over the radio, urgency clear in his tone. "You need to see this. Control room now." Exchanging a worried glance with Finley, Kaz hurried back into the rig's battered interior. The corridors were a maze of twisted metal and sparking wires, the air thick with the acrid smell of burnt electronics and something else, something alien that lingered despite their victory. The control room was a hive of activity. What remained of the crew huddled around monitors, their faces a mix of exhaustion and growing concern. "What is it?" Kaz demanded as she entered. Connor pointed to the main screen, his hand shaking slightly. "We've been running diagnostics trying to assess the damage. But look at this." The screen showed a schematic of the rig, overlaid with a web of pulsing lines that seemed to shift and move as they watched. "What am I looking at?" Kaz asked, a chill running down her spine. "Energy readings," Connor explained, his voice tight. "But not like anything we've seen before. It's as if the rig itself has been changed on a fundamental level." Finley leaned in, his brow furrowed. "Changed how?" Connor shook his head, frustration evident in every line of his body. "We don't know. The instruments can barely make sense of it. But whatever that thing was, whatever Mac did to stop it, it's left a mark. On the rig, maybe on us too." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. Their ordeal, it seemed, was far from over. Suddenly the klaxon's wail cut through the sombre atmosphere. Kaz rushed to the console, her eyes widening at the readouts. "We've got a massive energy surge," she announced, her voice tight with tension. "It's coming from where the entity was." Finley leaned in, his face pale. Could it be? Before he could finish, the rig shuddered violently. Emergency lights flickered as a wave of otherworldly energy washed over them, and then, impossibly, a figure materialized in the center of the room. It was McClary, but not the McClary they knew. His form rippled and shifted, as if struggling to maintain cohesion. His eyes glowed with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. When he spoke, his voice was a discordant chorus of whispers and echoes. We are here, he said, each word seeming to bend reality around it. Kaz approached cautiously, her heart pounding. Mac, is that really you? McClary's gaze focused on her, and for a moment she saw a flicker of recognition of humanity. Kaz Finley, I have returned, but changed. As the survivors gathered around, McClary explained haltingly, his words interspersed with flashes of cosmic imagery that burned themselves into their minds. He had indeed sacrificed himself to stop the entity, but in doing so, he had merged with it, his consciousness expanding to encompass vast cosmic awareness while still retaining a kernel of his human self. The entity. It's a part of me now, McClary said, his form stabilizing somewhat as he spoke. And I'm a part of it. We are becoming something new, something that bridges the gap between human and cosmic. The implications were staggering. McClary's return was a miracle, yes, but also a harbinger of the changes that were to come. He was living proof that humanity could survive contact with cosmic forces, but at a cost that was yet to be fully understood. As the shock of his return settled, a new reality began to dawn on the survivors. Their ordeal was far from over. With McClary as a living conduit to cosmic realms, they now faced the challenge of navigating a world irrevocably changed by their encounter with the entity. The aftermath of their cosmic encounter had taken an unexpected turn, and as McClary stood among them, both familiar and utterly alien. The survivors of the Brent Charlie realized that their journey into the unknown had only just begun. There's more. Trott's voice came from the doorway. The doctor looked haggard, his medical white stained with blood and worse. I've been examining the survivors. There are anomalies. Kaz felt her heart sink. What kind of anomalies? Trott hesitated, clearly struggling to find the words. Physiological changes, subtle but unmistakable. Increased neural activity, cellular mutations. It's as if exposure to that entity has triggered some kind of accelerated evolution. Evolution into what? Finley asked, voicing the fear they all felt. Before Trott could answer, an alarm blared from one of the consoles. Kaz rushed over, her fingers flying across the keyboard. We've got a breach in the lower levels, she announced, her voice tight with tension. Something's coming up from below. The crew mobilized with a speed born of desperation and hard-won experience. As they made their way to the breach site, armed with whatever makeshift weapons they could gather, Kaz couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. They reached the breach to find a sight that defied explanation. The metal of the hull was changing, flowing like liquid, reforming into shapes that hurt the eye to look upon directly. My God, someone whispered. It's not over. It's still here. As they watched in horror, a form began to take shape in the writhing metal, a form that was achingly familiar yet utterly alien. McClary stepped forward, his transformed being seeming to resonate with the changing structure. Not quite, he said, his voice a chorus of whispers, but also not entirely not. We are becoming. Kaz raised her weapon, though she knew in her heart it would be useless against whatever this was. What do you want? The McClary thing's face shifted, a kaleidoscope of expressions flitting across its fluid features. To understand, to evolve, to become something. More. As it spoke, tendrils of that same liquid metal began to creep across the floor towards them. The crew backed away, but Kaz stood her ground, her mind racing. "You're not him," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. McClary sacrificed everything to stop this, to save us. Whatever you are, you're not him. The being paused, its form rippling with what might have been uncertainty. Perhaps not. The boundaries between self and other, between human and cosmic, have become fluid. We are McClary, and we are the entity. We are the bridge between worlds. Before Kaz could respond, the ship's radio crackled to life. The voice of the rescue team's leader cut through the tension. "Brent Charlie, this is the Arctic Surveyor. We're preparing to board. Please respond." The McClary thing's head tilted, an all-too-human gesture that sent a chill down Kaz's spine. "They cannot know," it said. "The world is not ready for what we have become, for what you all may become." With that, it began to retreat, its form melting back into the rig's structure. But as it disappeared, its final words echoed in their minds, "This is only the beginning. Prepare yourselves. The cosmos has taken notice of humanity, and nothing will ever be the same." As the last traces of the entity vanished, leaving behind only twisted metal and unanswered questions, Kaz turned to face her crew. She saw in their eyes the same mix of fear, confusion, and grim determination that she felt. "What do we do now?" Finley asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kaz took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "We survive," she said. "We figure out what's happening to us, to the rig, and we make damn sure that whatever's coming next, we're ready for it." As the sound of the rescue team's approaching helicopters filled the air, Kaz couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the precipice of something vast and unknowable. They had won the battle against cosmic horror, yes, but the war, it seemed, was just beginning. And as the first rescuers set foot on the Brent Charlie's deck, none of them could have imagined the changes already taking root within the survivors. Changes that would reshape not just their lives, but the very future of humanity. The aftermath of their cosmic encounter was only the beginning of a journey into a new and terrifying unknown. Chapter 21. The Reckoning. The Arctic Surveyor, a state-of-the-art research vessel, had been hastily repurposed as a floating command center. Its pristine decks were now crowded with a mix of shell-shocked rig survivors, stern-faced government officials, and company executives whose polished facades barely concealed their growing panic. Kaz stood at the railing, watching as the remains of the Brent Charlie were systematically dismantled and loaded onto waiting barges. Each piece of twisted metal felt like a memory being torn away, evidence of their ordeal disappearing beneath the waves. Quite a sight, isn't it? The voice belonged to Adrian Reeves, a high-ranking executive from the oil company. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Amazing how quickly we can clean up our messes when we put our minds to it." Kaz turned to face him, her exhaustion momentarily overcome by a surge of anger. "Is that what this is to you? A mess to be cleaned up?" Reeves's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "Come now, Miss Rathbone. We both know that what happened out there is complicated. The world isn't ready for the truth. Hell, I'm not sure I'm ready for it, and I've read all the reports." Before Kaz could retort, a commotion near the ship's main hatch drew their attention. A group of men in dark suits was escorting someone onto the deck, someone whose presence made Kaz's heart skip a beat. "Mac!" She breathed, disbelief warring with hope. It was indeed Alistair McClary, or at least something that looked very much like him. He moved with an unnatural fluidity, his eyes scanning the deck with an intensity that was both familiar and alien. When those eyes landed on Kaz, a flicker of recognition passed across his face. "Kaz," he said, his voice a mixture of McClary's familiar tones and something else, something that sent a shiver down her spine. "We need to talk." Reeves stepped forward, his facade of friendliness dropping away. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mr. McClary. You're still under quarantine. For your own safety, of course." McClary, or the thing that had once been McClary, turned those unsettling eyes on Reeves. "You cannot contain this. You cannot hide the truth. The cosmos has taken notice of humanity, and nothing will ever be the same." The words were eerily similar to what the entity had said in the rig's lower levels. Kaz felt a chill run through her, a mixture of fear and something else, a strange, almost euphoric sensation that she'd been experiencing more and more since their encounter. "That's quite enough of that," Reeves snapped, gesturing to the suited men. "Take him back below." As they led McClary away, Kaz caught his eye one last time. In that moment she saw a flash of the man she had known, determined, defiant, and utterly human. It steeled her resolve. "You can't keep this quiet," she said, turning back to Reeves. "People deserve to know what's out there. What we faced, what we became." Reeves's expression hardened. "And what exactly do you think would happen if the world knew? Panic? Chaos?" "No, Miss Rathbone. Sometimes secrets are necessary for the greater good." Whose greater good? The new voice belonged to Finley, who had approached unnoticed. His eyes were sunken with exhaustion, but there was a fire in them that Kaz recognized. "The companies, the governments. What about the families of those we lost? Don't they deserve the truth?" Reeves opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by the arrival of a severe-looking woman in a crisp military uniform. "That's enough," she said, her voice brooking no argument. "Mr. Reeves, I believe you're needed in the command centre. As for you two," she turned to Kaz and Finley, "it's time for your debriefing. Follow me." As they were led away, Kaz caught glimpses of other survivors being similarly corralled. She saw the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty. But she also saw something else, a determination, a shared understanding of what they had been through and what was at stake. The debriefing room was sterile and cold, more an interrogation chamber than anything else. For hours, Kaz and Finley were grilled by a team of experts, scientists, military personnel, psychologists. They asked about the entity, about the changes to the rig, about McClary's transformation. But most of all, they asked about the survivors themselves. "Have you experienced any unusual symptoms?" A doctor asked, his pen poised over a thick file. "Changes in perception, physical abilities, thought patterns." Kaz hesitated, thinking of the strange sensations she'd been feeling, the moments of clarity that bordered on precognition. She glanced at Finley, saw the same conflict in his eyes. "No," she lied smoothly. "Nothing unusual." The doctor's eyes narrowed, clearly unconvinced. But before he could press further, an alarm blared throughout the ship. "What's happening?" Finley demanded as their interrogators rushed from the room. They got their answer moments later as the ship lurched violently. Through the porthole, Kaz saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. The sea was changing. Swirling patterns of bioluminescence spread across the waves, forming impossible geometries that hurt the eye to look upon. "It's not over," she whispered. It was never over. As chaos erupted around them, Kaz and Finley shared a look of grim understanding. Whatever was happening, whatever they were becoming, they couldn't let it be buried or weaponized by those in power. "We need to find Mac," Kaz said, her mind racing, "and we need to get off this ship." Finley nodded, a ghost of his old grin flickering across his face. "Oh, just another day at the office, eh?" As they slipped out of the room and into the pandemonium of the corridors, Kaz felt a surge of that strange, alien energy within her. She didn't fully understand what was happening to them, what they were becoming, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: the reckoning had only just begun. And this time, they would be the ones calling the shots. The truth would come out one way or another. And the world would have to reckon with the reality of what lurked in the cosmos, for better or for worse. As the Arctic surveyor shuddered beneath their feet, as the sky above darkened with unnatural storms, Kaz and Finley set out to find their transformed leader and take control of their own destiny. The battle against cosmic forces had changed them, had marked them. Now it was time to use that change to shape the future, not just for themselves, but for all of humanity. The reckoning was here, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 22. Escape from the deep. The Arctic surveyor groaned and shuddered, its hull straining against forces it was never designed to withstand. Alarms blared throughout the ship, their urgent wails nearly drowned out by the cacophony of twisting metal and shattering glass. Kaz and Finley raced through the chaos-filled corridors, dodging panicked crew members and falling debris. Their destination, the ship's brig, where McClary was being held. "You sure about this?" Finley shouted over the din, narrowly avoiding a shower of sparks from a ruptured electrical panel. Mac might not be. Well, Mac anymore. Kaz's jaw tightened. He's our best shot at understanding what's happening and getting out of here alive." They rounded a corner and came face to face with two armed guards outside the brig. Before either side could react, a violent tremor shook the ship. The guards lost their footing, and Kaz and Finley seized the opportunity, quickly disarming and subduing them. "Sorry, boys," Finley muttered as he grabbed a keycard from one of the unconscious men. "Nothing personal." The brig door slid open with a hiss, revealing McClary standing calmly in the center of the cell, his eyes still glowing with that unsettling otherworldly light fixed on them with an intensity that made Kaz's skin crawl. "You came," he said, his voice a discordant mixture of familiar and alien tones. "Good, it's time to leave." As if in response to his words, another violent tremor rocked the ship. The lights flickered ominously. "What's happening out there?" Kaz demanded as they hurried back into the corridor. McClary's fluid features rippled with something that might have been concern. "The entity, it's not defeated, merely changed. Evolved, and now it seeks to reclaim what it sees as its own." A chill ran down Kaz's spine. "Us! It's coming for us!" McClary nodded, his movements unnaturally smooth. "We are connected now, all of us who were exposed. We are the bridge between worlds, and it will not let us go easily." They made their way to the upper decks, fighting against the increasing list of the ship. The scene that greeted them as they burst onto the main deck was one of utter chaos. The sea around the Arctic Surveyor boiled and churned, shot through with ribbons of otherworldly bioluminescence. The sky above had darkened to an unnatural twilight, swirling with clouds that moved in impossible patterns. And rising from the depths surrounding the ship were massive tentacles of water and light. "My God," Finley breathed. "It's like the whole bloody ocean has come alive." McClary stepped forward, his eyes reflecting the eerie glow of the transformed sea. "Not alive, awakened. The entity's influence has spread further than we imagined." A desperate plan began to form in Kaz's mind. "The helicopters," she said, pointing to where several craft sat on the ship's helipad. "If we can get to them." They fought their way across the deck, battling against howling winds and waves that seemed to reach out with purpose. Crew members and officials ran in panic, some diving overboard in desperation only to be swallowed by the writhing sea. As they neared the helipad, a familiar figure stepped into their path. Adrian Reeves, his polished exterior now in tatters, brandished a pistol with shaking hands. "Stop right there," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear and desperation. "You can't leave. None of us can leave. We have to contain this." McClary stepped forward, seemingly unconcerned by the weapon aimed at his chest. "You cannot contain the cosmos, Mr. Reeves. You cannot hide from what we have awakened." As he spoke, McClary's form began to shift and flow, taking on aspects of the swirling patterns that surrounded them. Reeves stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. "What? What are you?" he gasped. "The future," McClary replied simply. Then, faster than the eye could follow, he lashed out. Reeves went flying, disappearing over the side of the ship into the churning waters below. Kaz stared at McClary, a mixture of awe and fear coursing through her. "Mac, are you still in there?" For a moment, something flickered in those alien eyes, a hint of the man she had known. "I'm here, Kaz, but I'm also more. We all are." Another violent tremor cut off any further discussion. The ship was beginning to break apart, massive cracks appearing in its hull. "We need to go, now!" Finley shouted, already racing towards the nearest helicopter. They piled in, Kaz taking the pilot's seat. As she started the engine, tendrils of water rose up, trying to ensnare the craft. McClary reached out, his hand shifting into something that crackled with energy. Where he touched the water tentacles, they recoiled, hissing with otherworldly steam. The helicopter lifted off just as the Arctic Surveyor gave a final, tortured groan and began to sink beneath the waves. As they rose into the air, Kaz could see other survivors clinging to debris, surrounded by the swirling, transformed sea. "We can't just leave them," she said, her hands tightening on the controls. McClary placed a hand on her shoulder, the touch sending a jolt of alien energy through her. "We cannot save them. Not yet. But we will return. This is only the beginning." As they flew away from the scene of devastation, the sea below them continued to churn and transform. The entity's influence was spreading, reshaping the very elements of their world. In the distance, Kaz could see the coast approaching. But it wasn't the safe harbour she had hoped for. Strange lights pulsed along the shoreline, and unnatural formations rose from the land. "It's everywhere," Finley whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror. "What do we do now?" McClary's gaze was fixed on the horizon, his eyes reflecting vistas beyond human comprehension. "We prepare. We learn. We evolve. The cosmos has opened to us, and we must be ready for what comes next." Kaz felt it then, a surge of that alien energy within her, a connection to something vast and unknowable. She knew that Finley felt it too. They were changed, marked by their encounter with cosmic forces, and now, as they flew towards an uncertain future, they carried within them the seeds of humanity's transformation. The helicopter sped on, carrying its cargo of changed humans towards a world that was rapidly becoming as alien as the depths they had escaped. The entity may not have been defeated, but neither had humanity. The true battle, the battle for the very nature of reality itself, was only just beginning. As the coast grew nearer, Kaz steeled herself for whatever lay ahead. They had escaped the deep, yes. But the deep had come with them, inscribed now in their very beings. And nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 23. Returned to shore, the helicopter touched down on the outskirts of Aberdeen, its rotors kicking up a swirl of debris and mist. As the blade slowed, an eerie silence fell, broken only by the distant sound of sirens and the unsettling hum that seemed to emanate from the very air around them. Kaz was the first to step out, her legs shaky after the intense flight. The familiar Scottish landscape before her looked subtly wrong, as if viewed through a warped lens. Colours seemed more vivid, shadows deeper, and there was a faint, shimmering quality to the air that made her eyes water. "It's spread this far already," Finley murmured, coming to stand beside her. His voice was a mixture of awe and dread. McClary emerged last, his fluid movements drawing wary glances from his companions. "The entity's influence knows no boundaries," he said, his gaze sweeping across the altered landscape. "It seeps into the very fabric of reality." A distant explosion drew their attention to the city proper. Plumes of smoke rose above the skyline, punctuated by flashes of unnatural light. The sound of panic car horns, breaking glass, and human cries drifted towards them on the wind. "We need to find our families," Kaz said, her heart racing at the thought of Mia and their daughter caught in the chaos. "Before it's too late." They made their way towards the city, the journey a surreal odyssey through a world in the process of transformation. Trees swayed with a sentience that sent chills down Kaz's spine. The ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with an alien rhythm. And everywhere people were reacting to the change, some fleeing in terror, others standing transfixed by the otherworldly beauty emerging around them. As they neared Kaz's neighbourhood, a familiar figure came running towards them. Mia, her face a mask of relief and fear, threw herself into Kaz's arms. "Oh God, Kaz," she sobbed. When we saw the news about the rig, I thought." Kaz held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of home. But even as she revelled in the reunion, she couldn't shake the feeling of otherness that had taken root within her. The alien energy that coursed through her veins seemed to recoil at the contact, as if recognizing Mia as untouched, unchanged. "Where's Lily?" Kaz asked, pulling back to look into Mia's eyes. "She's safe, at my sister's place outside the city. I came back to look for you." Mia's gaze drifted to Finley and McClary, her eyes widening as she took in their altered appearances. "What happened out there, Kaz? What's happening to the world?" Before Kaz could formulate a response, a wave of dizziness washed over her. Images flashed through her mind, vast cosmic vistas, civilizations rising and falling, the entity's influence spreading across galaxies. She staggered, steadied by Mia's concerned grip. "Kaz, what's wrong?" Mia's voice seemed to come from far away. "It's the change," McClary said, stepping forward. His presence seemed to intensify the alien sensations coursing through Kaz. "We are becoming something more than human, something that can bridge the gap between worlds." Mia recoiled, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Who? What are you? Where's the real Alistair McClary?" "I am McClary," he replied, his form rippling slightly. "But I am also more, as we all are becoming." Finley intervened, his voice gentle but strained. "Look, Mia, it's a long story, and one we don't fully understand ourselves. But right now we need to focus on getting somewhere safe. This is just the beginning of whatever's happening." As if to underscore his words, a nearby building suddenly began to twist and reshape itself, its architecture warping into impossible geometries. Screams erupted from within as its occupants fled. They made their way to Mia's sister's house on the outskirts of town, the journey a gauntlet of escalating strangeness. By the time they arrived, all of them, even Mia, could feel the change in the air, the sense of reality coming undone at the seams. Lily burst out of the house as they approached, her small face lit up with joy at the sight of Kaz. But as she drew near, she hesitated, her expression shifting to one of uncertainty. "Mummy," she said, her voice small and confused, "you look different." Kaz felt her heart break at the fear in her daughter's eyes. She knelt down, fighting against the alien urges that made such human contact feel strange and uncomfortable. "It's me, sweetheart. I'm still me. Things are just changing." As she embraced Lily, Kaz caught sight of her reflection in a nearby window. For a moment her form seemed to shift and flow, taking on aspects of the swirling patterns that now marked the sky. She quickly looked away, but the image burned itself into her mind. Inside the house, they gathered in the living room, the normality of the suburban setting at odds with the cosmic horror unfolding outside. Mia's sister, Sarah, watched them with wary eyes as Finley gave a abbreviated version of their ordeal on the rig. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked when he had finished. Is this the end of the world?" McClary, who had been staring out the window with an unreadable expression, turned to face them. "Not the end, a transformation. Humanity stands on the brink of becoming something greater, something cosmic. But the path will not be easy." Kaz, still holding Lily close, felt a surge of determination. "We need to find a way to control this. To understand what's happening to us, to the world. There must be others out there, scientists, leaders who can help." Finley nodded, his eyes reflecting the strange lights that now danced across the sky. "And we need to prepare for whatever comes next, the entity. It might not be done with us yet." As night fell, bringing with it new wonders and terrors in the transformed world outside, the survivors of the Brent Charlie found themselves at a crossroads. They were changed, marked by their encounter with cosmic forces. The world around them was rapidly becoming as alien as the depths they had escaped. But they were also still human, with human connections and human hearts. As Kaz looked around at her family, at her fellow survivors, she knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The return to shore had not been the end of their ordeal, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter in which humanity would have to redefine its place in a universe far stranger and more vast than they had ever imagined. As Lily drifted off to sleep in her arms, Kaz made a silent vow. They would find a way through this. They would learn to navigate this new reality, and somehow they would ensure that humanity emerged from this cosmic crucible not just changed, but transcendent. The night deepened, and with it came dreams of cosmic vistas and alien wonders. The survivors of the Brent Charlie, forever altered by their brush with the entity, stood watch over a world poised on the brink of unimaginable transformation. Their return to shore was complete, but their journey into the cosmic unknown had only just begun.